I never imagined that a simple longing for quieter days and clearer nights would lead me so far from the bustling edges of my old world. Yet here I am, Naomi Caldwell, perched on the cusp of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, enveloped by a stillness so profound it almost feels like I've tiptoed into another time. I used to be a teacher, a soft-spoken, introspective soul who found solace in books more than parties, and who preferred solitary lunches over the clamor of the staff room. It wasn't that I hated people. I simply grew weary of the constant noise of modern life, the jammed highways, and the gray silhouettes of city buildings that felt like they were pressing in on me. I yearned for a place where I could wake up without an alarm, brew coffee in peace, and greet the sunrise as if it were a quiet friend I hadn't seen in years. Eventually, I decided to take the leap. I sold my modest townhouse in a suburban sprawl, gathered my savings, and invested in a small patch of land near Luray, right on the edges of the Shenandoah Valley. I remember the drive the day I first arrived, how the road wound itself into gentle hills, each turn revealing a new tapestry of greenery and distant peaks. The air smelled different too, crisper, tinged with pine and damp earth. By the time I pulled up to what would be my new home, I felt like I'd stepped into a painting. The valley spread out in gentle folds, and the sky seemed to open itself, shedding layers of cloud to bathe the ridges in soft, amber light. My cabin was small, a single-story structure with a sloping roof and a wraparound porch that creaked if you stepped too hard. Its windows looked out onto a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the forest, and a modest clearing offered just enough space for a garden I hoped to plant. Of course, it needed work. The walls leaked cold air in the mornings, the old solar panels on the roof were finicky, and the floors bore the scars of years without proper maintenance. But it was mine, a place where I could shape my days according to my own gentle rhythm. It felt like I'd finally exhaled a breath I'd been holding since I first started teaching in the city. The first week was blissful in its simplicity. I'd wake up at dawn, brew a mug of black tea, and sit on the porch watching the sky shift from pale gray to gold. Sometimes a deer or two would wander at the edge of the clearing, nibbling on wild grasses. On my second morning, I discovered a slender red fox slinking through the underbrush, its keen gaze meeting mine for a moment before it vanished. Every day after that felt like a gift. I busied myself with chores, patching up the roof, trying to coax the antiquated solar array into storing enough power for lights and a tiny fridge, hauling water from a nearby creek that trickled down from the higher slopes. The tasks were physically tiring, yet they replenished me in ways grading papers and staff meetings never could. The valley's weather was unpredictable, though. One day, the sun would blaze overhead, turning the cabin's interior into a stuffy oven, while nights often brought sharp drops in temperature that made me shiver under thick blankets. Midway through my second week, a fierce gust of wind rattled the windows at dusk. I remember stepping onto the porch, inhaling the sudden swirl of cool air. The sky had grown dark with clouds, blotting out the final threads of daylight. My hair whipped across my face, and the ancient pines that circled the clearing bowed and swayed in unison, as if warning me of a storm. It was in that unsettled hush that I first felt a presence I couldn't explain, a prickle at the back of my neck, as though unseen eyes tracked my every movement. The wind roared. A few stray leaves spiraled across the porch, and I told myself I was just jumpy from the dramatic shift in weather. But that sense of being watched lingered. Over the next few days, I'd catch the faintest flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a blur near the tree line, or a quick shape crossing the path, and there were nights when I'd lie awake, certain I heard my name whispered through the cracks in the walls. Naomi, just like that, softly, carried by a breath of air. I half wondered if my exhausted mind was playing tricks, especially since I'd thrown myself into the daily grind of survival, collecting firewood, sorting out my precarious water system, learning to navigate the local roads to buy what meager supplies I couldn't produce myself. One Sunday, I decided to visit a local farmer's market in Luray, hoping to meet a few neighbors and maybe glean some tips for living comfortably off-grid. The market was set up in a modest parking lot, stalls brimming with fresh apples, homemade preserves, and folks selling crafts. I chatted with a kind older woman selling goat cheese, who asked if I was new in town. When I mentioned my cabin's location, her brow furrowed. She lowered her voice, remarking that the stretch of forest near my land was rumored to be unsettled ground. I didn't press her for details. Part of me, the rational part, dismissed this as local superstition, while another part filed the comment away in a mental folder labeled "Maybe relevant later." The suspicious glances or muttered remarks I got from some locals only deepened my curiosity. Over time, I heard snippets, how a pioneer family once tried to settle near the same ridge, or rumors of a hidden family cemetery lost in the woods, or even of a reclusive hermit who vanished decades ago. The stories changed with each telling, seldom matching from one retelling to the next. Still, a common thread emerged. My plot of land had a history that folks either didn't fully understand or preferred not to discuss openly. I brushed off these legends, at least initially. I told myself that old places spawn old stories, and that superstitions often cling to rural communities. But the nights grew eerier. One evening, I curled up in bed with a battered novel, the single lamp above me flickering weakly from my questionable solar setup. The wind was calm, no storms on the horizon. Yet, as I drifted towards sleep, I heard it again, a whisper, softer than before, drawn out over several seconds. Naomi. The syllables were almost intimate, like a friend calling from across a great distance. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. I listened, heard nothing else. Then came laughter, faint and low, as though someone stood right outside my window. I jolted up, flicking off the lamp, scanning the darkness beyond the glass, my breath quickening. The yard lay empty, bathed in the faint glow of moonlight. Eventually, I calmed enough to slip back under the covers, though I didn't sleep deeply. Morning came too soon, the corners of my mind haunted by that quiet, disembodied voice. Conflicted by these experiences, I retreated into my daily routines, hoping practicality would shore up my nerves. Yet the thought of a presence lurking at the edges of the woods became an unspoken weight I carried around. About 3 weeks into my new life, while I was struggling to fix a leak in my water collection system, a friendly man named Ellis wandered by. He was in his 70s, lean and spry, wearing faded overalls and a battered hat. He introduced himself as a local who lived a couple of miles down the road. We got to chatting, my worry about the unsettled ground simmering in the back of my head. Eventually, I broached the topic. Had he heard any stories of hauntings or old curses linked to this ridge? Ellis gave me a thoughtful look, then nodded slowly. "Folks around here don't talk about it much," he said. "But there's a tale of an old pioneer who tried to homestead near this ridge centuries ago. Some say he died in a harsh winter, searching for help that never came. Others speak of a family feud that spilled over the mountain trails. There's no single version that's gospel, but the gist is that a soul or two never found rest." He shrugged. "I've never seen anything myself, but people who've settled near your patch. They'd mention voices in the wind or glimpses of someone wandering the woods at night." My pulse quickened. I recalled the laughter, the whispered calling of my name, that persistent sense of being watched. I asked Ellis if he knew what people did about it. "Some just left," he replied, "packed up and moved to friendlier land. Others tried talking to old-timers who believed in rituals, small acts of appeasement. That's a can of worms, though. This is old land with old memories." After Ellis departed, a heavy quiet descended around me. I found myself scanning the trees, looking for flickers of movement in the green gloom. That evening, determined not to let fear dominate me, I rummaged through a collection of local history books I'd picked up at the farmer's market. I spent hours reading about the Shenandoah's past, the early settlers, the battles, the heartbreak, the illusions of grand new beginnings cut short by harsh realities. One name that recurred was Zebulon Gray, an elusive pioneer who'd once staked a claim in these hills and vanished along with his family. Some rumors said he froze in a winter storm. Others implied he was murdered by bandits. Hardly any official record existed. Yet references in diaries and letters suggested an ominous legacy tied to the land he'd chosen. When the wind rose that night, rattling the shutters, I imagined Zebulon Gray roaming the ridges, searching for what he'd lost. A chill lanced through me. I locked the doors, lit a small lantern, and told myself that I was letting rumors get under my skin. But my reflection in the window looked unconvinced, my eyes wary, shoulders tensed. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by half-dreams of shadowy figures drifting beneath tall pine canopies. I realized I needed help making sense of it. The next day, I tracked down a local folklorist named Miss Irene, rumored to be a treasure trove of stories about the valley's hidden corners. She lived in a quaint house on the outskirts of town. Wrinkles creased her face, but her sharp gaze hinted at a lifetime of curiosity. When I explained my predicament, she listened without judgment. Then she told me that if a spirit lingered, it might yearn for acknowledgement, not confrontation. Rituals, especially those that come from the region's old ways, can sometimes bring peace, she said. She mentioned burning sage or placing small offerings at a spot in the forest that felt unsettled. Sometimes it's enough for them to know you respect their presence, she added. That evening, armed with a bundle of sage and a handful of wildflowers Miss Irene had suggested, I ventured into the woods behind my cabin just after twilight. My heart pounded, but I was resolved not to let fear drive me away. I followed a faint deer trail that meandered deeper into the shadows, the sky darkening overhead, until only a dim silver haze remained through the leaves. At a small clearing near an outcrop of mossy rocks, the air felt still, almost charged with possibility. I knelt, lighting the sage, letting curls of pungent smoke rise into the hush. I whispered a few simple words, half prayer, half plea. I don't mean any harm. I'm here to live gently. Please, let us share this land in peace. Nothing dramatic happened at first. The forest remained silent. A breeze teased the edges of my hair. Then I heard it. A distant sigh, so faint it might have been the wind, but weighted with a sorrow that cut through me. I left the wildflowers at the base of a pine, the sage smoke lingering among the trunks. My pulse thundered in my ears as I carefully made my way back. When I reached the cabin, I felt oddly lighter, as though a tension had eased, if only a fraction. The next few nights, the laughter and whispered calling did not return. I slept more soundly, waking to warm sunlight and the chirp of birds. I let myself hope that maybe the old energy had recognized my respect, that Zebulon or whoever else might wander these woods had found a sliver of solace. Even the local wildlife seemed less jumpy. Deer ventured closer, and cardinals perched on my porch rail, pecking at seeds as though the hush had softened. It felt like a fragile truce, yet, as often happens, the stillness did not last. One weekend, a storm barreled across the valley, darkening the late afternoon sky to a bruised purple. Sheets of rain pounded the cabin, thunder rolling in prolonged growls that rattled the windows. I huddled by my small fireplace, stirring embers, flinching at each flash of lightning. Then, abruptly, the power from my solar battery flickered out. Darkness pressed in. In the gloom, the only light came from the fitful flames dancing on charred logs. I got up to check the breaker, cursing the storm for sabotaging my system. That's when I heard footsteps on the porch. Clear, deliberate steps, not just the wind or rain. My spine stiffened. The storm raged. Wind lashing the pines and lightning illuminated the scene outside in brief, staccato bursts. I hurried back toward the living room. My mind raced. Had some traveler gotten lost in the storm? Or was it something else? I called out, "Who's there?" Heart in my throat. No answer. Just a soft scraping on the door, as though nails or fingertips gently tested the wood. Then came the whisper, a low murmur that might have formed my name but was lost under a peal of thunder. Lightning flashed, revealing the window next to the door. In that split second of brilliant light, I saw a figure on the porch, tall, features obscured by shadow. My stomach clenched in raw terror. I was certain that if I opened the door, I'd see the face of a man from centuries past, or perhaps no face at all. A primal fear rooted my feet to the floor, each breath laboring as though I'd climbed a mountain. Another clap of thunder rattled the glass, the figure momentarily lost in darkness. Then, as I stared, the shape receded. I glimpsed movement along the porch's edge, the door handle jiggling slightly, but it never turned enough to open. A final flicker of lightning, and the figure was gone. Silence except for the storm's fury. I stood motionless for what felt like ages, waiting for another knock, another scrape. None came. Eventually, the storm subsided, replaced by a subdued drumming of rain. My limbs felt leaden, my skin clammy. I realized with a shaky exhale that whatever that presence was, it seemed to be testing me, or maybe letting me know it hadn't forgotten. I spent the rest of the night by the fireplace, dozing in and out, the loaded tension in my muscles refusing to release until dawn. In the morning, I found wet footprints on the porch, fading away near the steps. Just footprints, leading nowhere else. The boards were damp from rain, but the footprints were distinct enough to make me swallow hard. They looked like a man's boots, old-fashioned in shape, narrower at the toe than modern footwear. I stared at them until the sun dried them into invisibility. That day, I resolved that if I was to remain here, I needed to acknowledge more actively the spirit that haunted these woods, maybe find a deeper form of cleansing, or a local custom to appease it. Fear gnawed at me, but I also felt an odd sympathy. Perhaps this presence was anchored by heartbreak or betrayal, longing for something none of us could give. Acting on a tip from the local folklore, I invited Miss Irene to my cabin to perform a more complete ceremony. She arrived with a small burlap pouch of local herbs, some sweetgrass braids, and a battered journal of old Appalachian blessings. Together, at twilight, we walked beyond the clearing, deep into the pine forest. The spot we chose was near a ring of large stones, half buried in moss. An area Ellis once mentioned might have been an old pioneer campsite. Irene lit the sweetgrass, singing a soft chant under her breath. I placed a modest offering, a folded note in which I'd scribbled words of compassion, acceptance, and a plea for peace. The wind picked up, a swirl of leaves at our feet, but we pressed on, sprinkling a mixture of salt and dried rosemary around the clearing. I felt an eerie quiet gather, as if the forest itself listened with bated breath. For a moment, I sensed a shift, a gentle hush that could have been a nod of recognition. I recall the way the pines seemed to stand still, their needled branches no longer swaying. Irene's voice rose in a final line of the chant, then sank into silence. The ephemeral hush remained for a few heartbeats, and I felt tears prick my eyes, from relief or exhaustion, or maybe the intangible sorrow that cloaked this land. Then a breeze returned, carrying away the smoke, and the tension ebbed, replaced by a calm that settled like a light blanket over the clearing. We walked back to the cabin under dim starlight. Neither of us spoke much, but Irene smiled gently and patted my shoulder before leaving. "Sometimes respect is all that's needed," she said, sliding into her old pickup. I waved her off, gratitude and lingering apprehension swirling in my chest. That night, I slept in my bed for the first time in weeks without waking to phantom voices or laughter. When morning came, the birds sang so robustly it almost felt like a celebratory chorus. I wanted to believe that we'd found a fragile peace, that Zebulon, or whatever restless spirit roamed these hills, had accepted the offering we'd made. In the weeks that followed, the oppressive sense of being watched diminished. The eerie calls at dusk ceased, replaced by more natural woodland sounds, the hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a fox, though a small part of me remained on edge, anticipating a sudden return of that unnerving presence. The days were pleasantly uneventful. I tended my fledgling garden, refined my water system, and even took short hikes into the deeper pockets of Shenandoah's trails. I learned to identify edible plants, discovered hidden viewpoints from rocky outcrops, and spent hours painting small watercolors of the valley, capturing the interplay of light and shadow across the ridges. Now and then, though, I'd glimpse something at the corners of my sight, a flicker of movement behind a stand of pines or a silhouette cresting a slope, but it was fleeting, absent the malice or sorrow I once felt. I'd pause, half smiling at the intangible visitor, whispering a soft greeting in case it lingered. Each time, the forest responded only with the gentle rustle of leaves. I've chosen to stay, forging a new life here. The solar panels still give me headaches occasionally, and the weather can be punishing, but none of that feels insurmountable compared to the terror I faced when I first heard those whispers in the night. I keep small protective rituals in my daily routine, burning sage at dawn, leaving a handful of wildflowers at the edge of the clearing each Sunday, acknowledging the history of this place rather than pretending it's a blank slate. In my quiet, introspective way, I've learned to share these hills with the lingering echoes of a past I cannot fully unravel, but can at least respect. I am Naomi Caldwell, once a teacher lost in the hum of suburban demands. Now I watch the Shenandoah sunrise each morning, listening to the wind that sweeps across the ridge, carrying stories from centuries long gone. Though some nights I still sense a hush that settles too deeply, or a voice that murmurs my name from the tree line, I respond with calm acceptance. I can coexist with the shadows of this land, reminding myself that the living and the departed share more in common than we might think. Each day, I wake to the hush of the valley. Each night I sleep to the lullaby of distant crickets, and in between, I walk a line between fear and wonder. This is my home now, a place shaped by old heartbreak and older hopes, where I've learned to find my own fragile peace despite the echoes that wander the dark. I can trace the moment I decided to run off the map to a particular morning in my old life. I was working as a mechanic in East Houston, dawn light slanting into the greasy bay of our shop, my hands stiff from years of handling wrenches and spark plugs. My boss was rattling off a list of urgent repairs, and the roar of traffic outside was a constant reminder that the city was swallowing me alive. Something in me just snapped. I couldn't stand the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead, the asphalt underfoot, or the endless noise of car engines revving in the gloom. I wanted out, plain and simple, a real quiet, maybe for the first time in my life. I'd heard rumors of the Big Thicket region to the northeast, a place of ancient pines, dense wetlands, and a hush so deep it made your ears ring. A wilderness that might let me breathe again. It was a foolhardy plan, maybe, but I scrimped, saved, sold most of my junk, and took the biggest leap I'd ever dared. Finding a patch of land out near the Big Thicket wasn't easy. Most folks said it was too remote, too swampy, or that it lacked the amenities to be comfortable for an ex-city boy like me. I guess I have a stubborn streak. After a few weeks of scouring classifieds and driving down rutted country lanes, I stumbled on a small property that used to belong to a distant relative of the seller. The cabin was practically caving in from decades of humidity, its porch half rotted, the inside overrun by wasps and lizards. but the area around it was a revelation. Towering loblolly pines framed a clearing beside a meandering creek that fed into the labyrinth of wetlands. No paved roads, no neighbors in sight, just the rustle of the wind in the brush and the occasional caw of a distant heron. The real estate agent looked like she expected me to flee after seeing the condition of the place. Instead, I told her I'd take it. I remember the day I moved in. I drove my old pickup loaded with hand tools, a generator, and a battered mattress. The final half-mile was barely more than a deer trail, the cab jostling so hard I thought the suspension might give out. But then I arrived, sweaty and exhausted, and parked in the shade. The warm East Texas air wrapped me in a sticky embrace, thick, green-scented, teeming with insects. I stood there and just breathed, letting a rare sense of calm flow through me. Even in the silence, I felt like the land was humming with a slow heartbeat. A frog croaked somewhere near the water. A dragonfly buzzed by, iridescent in the dappled sunlight. Yeah, I told myself, this is where I'll start over. I got to work right away, ignoring the mosquitoes that whined around my ears. Fixing the cabin was priority one. The roof leaked, so I hammered down new tin sheets. The windows were cracked, so I replaced them with salvaged glass from a junkyard near the highway. Every chore was laborious, made worse by the relentless humidity. Sweat soaked through my shirt by mid-morning. At night, I bunked on that old mattress in a corner, listening to the rise and fall of crickets and bullfrogs. It was exhausting, but also oddly comforting. The sense that I was forging my own path, away from the roar of city traffic. It took about a week to get the cabin semi-livable. I rigged a basic solar setup for lights, relying on the generator only for power tools. My plan was to be as off-grid as possible. Water from the creek was next on my list, though I had to figure out filtration and a decent pump. The muck near the water's edge was spongy, a mix of mud and decaying leaves, and cypress knees rose like gnarled fingers from the shallows. It was the type of land city folks imagine in nightmares, but I found its quiet persistence beautiful. Mosquitoes and I had an ongoing war, but I'd come prepared with nets and coils and repellent that kept me from losing my mind. At first, the wildlife was my biggest hurdle. Raccoons raided my food supply if I forgot to secure it. Snakes appeared on my porch, sunning themselves in the early rays. Alligators lurked further downstream, so I kept an eye out whenever I ventured near deeper water. Over time, I adapted. I learned to store food in airtight containers, to check for snakes under the porch, and to leave the local gators be. The big thicket, for all its ferocity, began to feel like an ally. Just had to treat it with respect. But once I was past the obvious challenges, I started noticing things that unsettled me in a different way. Late at night, sometimes around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd wake up to a sound in the distance. A deep, guttural growl, almost like a big cat or bear, except the timbre of it was off, reverberating through the swamplands. The first time it jolted me out of sleep, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch in my boxers, heart hammering. The night pressed in around me, thick as tar, and for a moment all I heard was my own breathing. Then it came again, a low, almost hoarse rumble that raised the hairs on my arms. Maybe 100 yards away, maybe less. I shone my light across the clearing, but the beam just stabbed into darkness. No glint of eyes, no reflection. Eventually, the growls faded, leaving me shaken. Other nights, the forest would go dead silent. No frogs, no crickets, nothing. Silence like that usually spooks me more than any noise. I'd stand by the window, scanning the shadows, convinced I saw shapes lurking between the pines. I told myself it was paranoia. Even so, a sense of being watched burrowed into my chest like a slow, creeping dread. And the footprints. Good Lord, the footprints. One morning, after a particularly bad storm, I walked around to check the clearing for damage. Puddles had formed in the soft earth, and I found prints that looked vaguely like a dog's but freakishly large. The spacing suggested something walking on 2 legs. I cursed under my breath, snapped a photo on my phone. Maybe a black bear with a weird gait, I reasoned. Or a big feral hog. Didn't quite match either. The mud gave them a crisp outline, 4 toes, an elongated pad, trailing off into deeper brush. I tried to track them, but they disappeared near the creek as though whatever made them had waded into the water. Not long after, the nightmares started. Vivid images of a tall, lanky figure stalking through the swamp, its eyes glowing like faint embers in the gloom. Each time, I woke drenched in sweat, certain I'd heard that guttural growl echo in my sleeping mind. I took to carrying a shotgun when I worked outside at dusk, cursing my own cowardice. But every rational part of me insisted there had to be a normal explanation. I'd built up a friendly rapport with the clerk at a small supply store about 10 miles away. So one afternoon, I asked him if he'd heard any stories about weird sightings in the big thicket. He gave me a side glance, half laughing, saying the only weird sightings were tourists lost on the back roads. Still, I pressed him, and eventually he muttered something about local legends of a shape-shifting swamp spirit or something akin to a Wendigo. Probably nonsense, he said, but old folks talk about hearing howls at night, seeing eyes in the cypress stands. They say you got to treat the swamp right or it'll treat you wrong. He shrugged, dismissing it as folklore. But the mention of shape-shifting spirits lodged in my head like a splinter. With my curiosity piqued, I drove further into the region, stopping at a place known for homemade crawfish stew and cold beer. I managed to eavesdrop on older men telling stories about the thicket's hidden corners, how some folks never came back from the deepest sloughs, how ancient powers roamed in the gloom. I started piecing together a patchwork of local superstition, a creature or spirit that fed on fear and thrived in the swamp's isolation, sometimes glimpsed as a tall silhouette or heard as a baleful moan. The accounts varied, but the dread was the same. It was after midnight on a muggy August night when I truly understood the fear behind those stories. I was outside, braving the mosquitoes for a quick smoke. The sky was overcast, so not even stars for comfort, just darkness upon darkness. Then the growl came, deep and reverberant, from maybe 50 yards behind the cabin. Adrenaline surged. I threw down my cigarette and grabbed the shotgun from inside. My heart hammered so loud I barely heard myself think. Slowly, I moved around back, shining a strong beam from a rechargeable lantern. The pines loomed tall, their branches swaying in a slight breeze. I nearly jumped out of my skin when that growl rumbled again, closer this time. I swung the light toward the sound and glimpsed a shape slinking between trunks. It moved unlike any animal I'd seen, almost fluid, gliding. My pulse spiked, panic gripping me so hard I could hardly breathe. I must have fired a shot in terror because the deafening crack of the shotgun echoed through the clearing, but I didn't aim properly. The muzzle flash lit up a portion of the woods for a heartbeat, revealing nothing but a swirl of undergrowth. Then silence, thick and suffocating. I stood there panting, sweat dripping down my neck, knowing I'd seen something but unable to prove it even to myself. Eventually, I crept back inside, locking the door, feeling more alone than ever in this vast swamp. The next day, I found no blood, no tracks, just trampled ferns. Maybe I'd missed entirely, or maybe it wasn't something that bullets could hurt. That thought rattled me in ways I wasn't prepared to face. Sleep became elusive, every nighttime sound amplifying into potential danger. I realized I was sinking into paranoia, half tempted to abandon the entire homesteading dream. But I'd never been a quitter. So I looked into local beliefs about appeasing the spirit of the land. Some folks said you had to bury an offering or vow not to pollute the waters. Others recommended simple blessings with sage or cypress boughs. A grizzled neighbor named Bart, who lived about 4 miles away, told me, "Look, if you want to survive the thicket, you show it respect. Don't chop down old cypress. Don't poison the creek. Let the swamp see you're just there to live, not conquer. That line stuck with me. Let the swamp see you're there to live, not conquer. So, at dusk, one night, I walked to the edge of my property where the cypress grove thickened. I carried a handful of small items, a shaped piece of cedar I'd carved while fiddling with my whittling knife, a bag of dried herbs for a makeshift incense, and a simple note, written in quiet desperation, that read, "I only want peace here. I will not harm you or the land." I felt a bit foolish, but I forced myself to stand there as the day's last light melted away. My breath caught each time leaves rustled, but I pushed on, sprinkling the herbs in a circle, lighting them so they smoldered and released a pungent scent that drifted among the pines. Then, in a low voice, I spoke. "I'm Trevor Banks. I came here to live, not destroy. I give you my word I'll protect this land as best I can." My throat felt tight, my words raw. I staked the cedar carving into the soft ground, placing the note beneath it. Then I listened. For a minute or two, the air remained thick with stillness. No wind, no birds, no sign of an answer. Days passed, and it seemed like the atmosphere eased, bit by bit. The nights were still unnervingly quiet, but I didn't hear the growl as often. Once I caught a faint shape in the gloom near the creek, but it melted away without confrontation. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe it had worked, that this swamp spirit or Wendigo-like being had accepted my vow. I kept my word, too. I avoided cutting down big trees, used biodegradable soaps, minimized any harm I might do to the ecosystem. My cabin remained modest, my presence subdued. If I had to clear brush, I did it sparingly, apologizing under my breath as if the land could hear me. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Some nights, particularly when storms brewed, I sensed that old dread creeping back. But hostility gave way to a fragile coexistence. On a calm evening near the end of the month, I sat on my porch, strumming a beat-up guitar I'd rescued from a pawn shop back in Houston. The frogs croaked in a choir around me, and I felt that watchful presence out there among the pines, like eyes flickering in the undergrowth. I didn't shy away. I just let the music flow in a soft, unpolished melody. A hush fell, and for a moment it felt as though the entire swamp was listening. I can't describe the relief that washed over me, the sense that a line had been drawn. I was no longer an unwelcome trespasser, but a cautious visitor allowed to remain. Folks in town still raise eyebrows when they learn I live so deep in the thicket, but I rarely volunteer the entire story. It's enough to say I respect the land, and the land, in turn, tolerates me. My off-grid life is far from perfect. Mosquito bites still sting like fire. The generator fails more often than I'd like, and I see wild boars snorting around the clearing sometimes. But the oppressive terror that once haunted my nights has mostly subsided, replaced by an odd camaraderie with the wilderness. Every now and then, I'll discover footprints or broken twigs arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be an accident, as though my invisible neighbor leaves subtle reminders that it still roams these swamps. I take these signs in stride, leaving small tokens or scattering corn for the deer, mindful of every step. One afternoon, a traveling journalist came through the area doing a piece on the Big Thicket's biodiversity. She swung by my cabin, camera in tow, asking if I'd had any strange experiences. I thought about the half-seen silhouettes, the guttural growls, the hush that descends at random, and my timid offering of cedar and an apology. In the end, I just shrugged and said, "The thicket's got a life of its own. Treat it right. It'll treat you fair." She smiled, probably thinking me a run-of-the-mill hermit. I didn't mind. Some stories aren't meant for casual retelling. When night falls now, I often sit under the porch light with a glass of sweet tea, gazing at the silhouette of the pines and cypress. Sometimes the breeze rustles the canopy. Sometimes frogs belt out a raucous symphony. I think about the city, about the roar of traffic and the neon flicker of convenience stores, and I feel no longing to return. I was an ex-mechanic, battered by the mechanical grind, but out here, each day is a new improvisation of survival and respect. The big thicket demanded humility, forced me to acknowledge there are forces older and deeper than anything you can fix with a wrench. Occasionally, if the moon is bright enough, I glimpse a shadow slip between the trunks, and that old spike of fear twitches in my chest. But I remind myself of my vow, to tread lightly, to do no harm, to accept that some mysteries prefer to remain half hidden in the cypress gloom. Maybe that shape out there is the same spirit, checking to see if I keep my promise. Or maybe it's something else entirely, drawn by the faint glow of my porch light and the lonely chords of my guitar. Either way, the hostility is gone, replaced by something akin to cautious curiosity. I figure that's the best I can hope for out here. A tenuous peace, a private understanding that the swamp is alive in ways we don't fully grasp. I've learned to sleep through the nights now. I dream of wading through misty wetlands, of hearing low growls transform into fleeting whispers that fade with the morning sun. When I wake, the sense of dread no longer suffocates me. Instead, I feel a quiet gratitude for having found a fragile space I can call home. So I remain, living day by day, forging a relationship with this land. I fix engines for local ranchers when they ask, earn a little cash here and there. I haul supplies in my pickup along the rutted track. I watch the creek rise and fall. The seasons shift from scorching summers to mild, drizzly winters. And I offer silent thanks each time the hush around me feels less like an omen and more like acceptance. That's enough for me. The swamp spirit or Wendigo-like presence, whatever it is, might never vanish. But we've reached a truce I can live with, a soft, unspoken understanding that, as long as I respect the thicket, it will allow me to stay. Sometimes I still recall the city, the mechanical shriek of gears and the harsh neon at midnight. But then a breeze rustles the pine needles, or I hear a barred owl hooting in the distance, and I know in my bones that I've chosen the right exile. Perhaps what roams these wetlands will always keep watch, ready to warn me or scare me off if I stray from my vow. I can't say I'm entirely fearless. My old shotgun remains by the door, and the memory of that shape dancing between the trees still threads a chill up my spine. Yet I no longer feel like prey in the night. Instead, I feel like a guest who's been granted the rare privilege of staying in a realm shaped by shadow and old magic. So I live quietly, as I always wanted. I fix up my cabin board by board, greet each sunrise with a thankful nod, and drift into evenings lulled by frogs and cicadas, content to share these whispered nights with a spirit older than any map can chart. I left behind the bright neon haze of my old life on a damp, drizzly morning, cramming my camera equipment and a few dusty boxes of clothes into a borrowed van, and driving west until the city skyline gave way to rolling farmland. My name is Grace Pennington, and I used to be a photographer of swirling traffic lights, towering skyscrapers, and the busy hum of urban nights. I made a decent living shooting editorial pieces and the occasional wedding, but the constant noise, both literal and figurative, began to weigh on me. I needed space to breathe, to allow my lens to capture something more profound than office blocks and congested thoroughfares. In an impulsive moment of longing, I stumbled upon a quiet listing for a tiny property in the Hocking Hills of Ohio, near Old Man's Cave, and I felt an inexplicable pull. When I first set eyes on the land, it was late spring, and the hardwood forests were flush with green. A narrow lane led to a simple, weathered cabin perched on a slight slope. A short walk beyond that slope revealed a deeper ravine, festooned with moss-covered rocks, hidden waterfalls and damp caverns carved out by centuries of trickling water. I remember standing on the property's edge, inhaling the smell of wet earth and lichen, and hearing my heart thrumming with a mixture of nerves and excitement. It felt right, completely different from the city's roar. I convinced myself I could handle the isolation, the crickets humming at night, the darkness that came without streetlights, because in return, I'd have the hush of forest trails and the camera's promise to capture scenes I'd only glimpsed in travel magazines. I had enough savings to purchase the place outright. The cabin was small, with a slanting roof and a porch that looked like it had fended off one too many storms. Inside, it smelled of mildew and cedar, the floorboards protesting every footstep. A minor mold problem lurked in the corners. No surprise given the region's damp climate. The windows were so murky they looked as if they'd been painted over, and the meager electricity came from a shaky off-grid setup. A few solar panels on the cabin's roof, hooking into ancient batteries that flickered and hissed. Still, it had running water from a well, and with a bit of elbow grease, I believed I could transform it into a cozy home base for my photography expeditions. Those first days, I worked from dawn to twilight, scrubbing walls, airing the place out, installing better ventilation to keep mold at bay. The forest welcomed me with a subdued hush. Whenever I stepped outside, I heard the rustle of leaves in the canopy overhead, the drip of water from the ravine after a rain, and the creak of tall trees. There was a certain intimacy to this environment, as though the land was breathing around me, a slow exhalation that said, "Yes, you can stay here, if you learn our rhythms." In the afternoons, I'd wander down to Old Man's Cave, a popular spot for hikers, though in these off hours I often had the place to myself. I'd set up my tripod to capture the interplay of sunlight and shadow on the cave's walls. Sometimes, water droplets caught the light like tiny jewels. My lens captured angles of rock formations that seemed otherworldly. I was tired, sweaty, and more content than I'd been in years. Then the strangeness began creeping in, softly at first. One humid night, I returned from a day of photographing local wildlife, raccoons, white-tailed deer, even a few elusive salamanders, to find the inside of the cabin more humid than usual, an odd smell lingering like wet stone. I chalked it up to the persistent dampness of the area, but my gut told me something else was off. I checked the walls for new mold, but nothing stood out. As I crawled into bed, a sense of being watched clung to me. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was the hush of unfamiliar nighttime woods. Yet my heart pounded a little too fast, and every crack and groan of the old structure felt amplified. Sleep came fitfully. I woke to a faint scraping noise outside, like a branch dragging across the cabin's exterior. My first thought was wind in the trees, but the forest seemed oddly still. I flicked on a small lantern, peering out to the closest window, half expecting to see a stray animal rummaging around. Darkness pressed up against the glass, my reflection peering back at me, wide-eyed. No sign of anything. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, clutching my pillow, trying not to let the anxiety sink deeper. Over the next few days, I refocused on my photography. Hocking Hills beckoned me with so many locations, cliffs, waterfalls, hidden caves. I wandered deeper along the winding trails, camera slung over my shoulder, enthralled by how the damp air brought out the emerald tones of moss and fern. But often, I caught an unsettling flicker out of the corner of my eye, a shape in the reflection of cave walls, a shadow shifting behind a tree. Each time I pivoted my lens that way, the shape vanished, leaving me uncertain whether it was my imagination or something real. My footsteps echoed strangely in the caverns, as though someone behind me mimicked each step, lagging just a second too late. A few hikers I met on the main trails suggested local lore, rumors of old hermits who once lived in the caves, tragedies where lost explorers never emerged, even superstitions about echoes that carry lost souls. I half laughed at these stories. I had no time for ghost tales. Mold control and broken solar inverters were more pressing. Still, the back of my neck would prickle whenever the cave floors grew silent, and I picked up faint, echoing whispers that didn't match any language I knew. Then, in the gloom of one overcast afternoon, I ventured into a smaller cave I'd found just off the main old man's cave system. It wasn't listed on any official map. I was hoping for unique shots of stalactites or an underground creek. The mouth of the cave was partly hidden by a tumble of boulders, requiring me to crawl through a gap on my hands and knees. Once inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet limestone. Water dripped steadily, forming shallow pools on the uneven floor. I turned on my headlamp, took a slow breath, and started exploring. The walls glistened, casting back fractured reflections whenever I snapped a photo. My boots splashed softly as I advanced. I was alone, truly alone. The outside world hushed by the stone around me. About 50 feet in, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. At the far side, in the beam of my headlamp, I noticed something peculiar. A set of old footprints, as if someone had walked there barefoot on the damp silt. They seemed faint, but definitely human, leading deeper into darkness. My pulse quickened. Could it be recent? Who else was exploring these lesser-known caverns? The idea of running into a curious local or another nature lover didn't frighten me so much as the possibility of a homeless squatter, or someone desperate who might not welcome my intrusion. I reminded myself I had no reason to panic. It was just footprints in an old cave. So I eased forward, stepping carefully to avoid messing them up. The footprints led to a corner where water trickled down in a narrow rivulet. Then they vanished. There was nowhere else to go, just a blank rock wall. I felt a wave of confusion. I scanned the wall with my headlamp, wondering if there was a hidden passage. Nothing. The footprints ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished into the stone. A heaviness settled in my gut, a sense that the air around me had grown stale and watchful. For a moment, I considered calling out, but the hush of the cave pressed on my chest, warning me not to. I snapped a few photos, though my hands trembled. Then, heart pounding, I turned and made my way out. Back at the cabin, I tried to process what I'd seen. Could I have been confused by water patterns on the cave floor? Maybe the footprints were older, or the water had seeped from another tunnel. My rational mind churned out theories, yet I couldn't forget how crisp those footprints looked, and how unaccountably they just stopped. The next day, I tried to explore that cave again, but a sense of dread thickened with each step into the darkness, eventually compelling me to retreat. My photos from that day turned out eerie. The ones that included the footprints had weird lens flares or distortions. Blame the wet environment, I told myself, but it felt more sinister, like the camera was capturing fragments of something best left unseen. That week, nights in the cabin became a dance of sleeplessness. The faint scraping at the walls returned, sometimes mingling with an echo of far-off chanting. I questioned my own sanity. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks on me. I even started leaving a small lamp on at night, an attempt to stave off the intangible feeling of being observed. On a whim, I visited a local diner in search of conversation or reassurance. Sipping coffee, I overheard older patrons talk about the lost hermit of the hills, some lonely soul who lived in the caves after losing everything, rumored to vanish decades ago. Most dismissed it as legend, but my ears perked up. Footprints, illusions in the caves. Could it all tie together? A new tension built inside me, a contradictory urge to solve this ghostly puzzle, and a strong desire to pretend it didn't exist. My photography work progressed. Damp ferns, sparkling waterfalls, but the specter of those footprints and the nightly noises overshadowed each accomplishment. As if that wasn't enough, the cabin's mold problem escalated. One morning, a patch of greenish-white growth marred the living room corner. No matter how diligently I scrubbed or replaced sections of drywall, The damp hillside climate seemed determined to reclaim the space. I felt the environment itself was pushing back, an unconscious reflection of my deepening unease. Then came the moment that truly rattled me. I'd hiked a lesser-known ravine, capturing shots of a hidden waterfall. The day was overcast, the forest gloomier than usual, and the wind sighed through the tree canopies like a lament. On my return, I decided to pass near Old Man's Cave to see if the light in the cavern looked interesting. The main path was deserted. The tourist season passed its peak. I ducked under a rocky overhang, camera in hand, drawn by a flicker of watery light ahead. Then I heard a voice, low, murmuring. I froze, scanning for a fellow hiker. Nothing. The voice continued, echoing in the cave's acoustic hush. A slow, rhythmic recitation, though I couldn't catch the words. It felt old, raw with sorrow. Goosebumps prickled across my arms. With careful steps, I followed the echo, adrenaline spiking my senses. As I turned a corner in the cave, the chanting abruptly ceased. My camera strap slid off my shoulder, and I scrambled to keep from dropping it. In that flicker of distraction, I glimpsed a figure at the far edge of the cavern, a dim silhouette, tall and thin, half hidden in the gloom. I raised my camera, but by the time I pressed the shutter, the shape had slipped away. I rushed forward, nearly tripping over slick rocks, but found only emptiness. No footprints this time, just the constant drip of water from the stalactites. My pulse hammered, fear and curiosity locked in a swirling knot in my chest. That evening at home, I pored over the photo, hoping I'd captured something. A smudge, a suggestion of a shape, nothing more. Yet, zooming in, I caught the faint outline of a face, or maybe it was a trick of the cave's textures. My rational side insisted on illusions, but deep down I believed I'd glimpsed the lost hermit, or his lingering essence. The idea that I'd physically encountered a ghost, or a memory, or some energy anchored to these damp corridors left me unsettled in ways I couldn't rationalize. I needed help. The next day, I visited a small cultural center in town where a local historian sometimes gave lectures on Appalachian folklore. I cornered him after a talk, explaining, without admitting the full extent of my experiences, that I'd encountered odd phenomena in the caves. He was a kindly gentleman with a mild smile. After I nudged him, he recounted the story of a reclusive man who'd lost his family to illness, retreating into the Hocking Hills to escape society's pity. Rumor had it he lived in those caves, occasionally emerging to gather supplies from unsuspecting travelers, only to vanish again. Over time, the region spun his tale into a cautionary legend. Some claimed he never truly left, that his sorrowful spirit remained. The historian shrugged, concluding most such stories are just exaggerations. But his eyes said he believed there might be a grain of truth. Back at my cabin, I weighed the possibility of a haunting or a presence. Did it need something? Like closure? A memorial? Or was it simply an echo, wandering without rest? My grandparents used to say that the unquiet dead sometimes needed acknowledgement. A prayer, a symbol, a gentle gesture that told them they weren't forgotten. The notion felt archaic, but I had few better ideas. The next morning, I gathered a small plaque and a handful of wildflowers, deciding to venture into that lesser-known cave where I'd found the footprints. Perhaps I'd leave a token of respect, an unspoken apology for intruding. If it sounded silly, I didn't care. My sleepless nights demanded I try. The cave's interior was as I remembered. Slick walls, dripping water, a hush that pressed on my ears. This time, fear curled in my stomach. I set down my tripod, braced myself, and walked to the chamber where footprints once ended. The air was colder there. No sign of footprints this time, just glistening stone. My heart pounded as I placed the plaque against the wall, carefully laying the wildflowers beside it. I whispered something about peace, about acknowledging the hermit's pain, about hoping he'd find rest. My own voice sounded tiny in the gloom. I stood there a moment, letting the quiet saturate me. The water dripped in slow rhythms. Then I snapped a single photo of the small arrangement. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to exhale, as if releasing tension. Just as I turned to go, I heard a soft rustling behind me. Instinct told me not to spin around in panic, so I moved slowly. The hair on my neck stood on end. Out of the corner of my vision, a shape flickered. A silhouette so faint it could have been cast by my headlamp. I didn't speak. I just nodded, as if to a presence. A wave of sadness washed over me. Maybe it was mine. Maybe it was the cave's. Then the shape melted away into the shadows, making my exit felt like walking through a dream. The tunnel seemed brighter, each dripping stone reflecting a gentle shimmer. When I emerged into the overcast light of day, tears pricked my eyes, a release of tension and an odd sense of relief. I lingered outside, letting the forest's damp air wrap me up. I couldn't say if the ceremony I performed meant anything cosmic, but something in me felt lighter. Since then, the nights have grown calmer. The scraping against my cabin walls ceased, replaced by the usual rustle of raccoons or deer. The mold problem, though still annoying, hasn't escalated to the unmanageable. I get more restful sleep, my dreams less plagued by shadows or phantom footprints. When I revisit the caves, the sense of dread is tempered by a cautious reverence. My photography flourishes. I've captured images of waterfalls cloaked in morning mist, ravines shimmering with autumn leaves, deep caves glowing in candlelight I sometimes set up for effect. Each shot resonates with a quiet acceptance of this land's mysteries. Sometimes I still sense a presence trailing me through the hollows, or I catch a fleeting reflection in a pool of water that resembles a thin figure. But it doesn't scare me the way it once did. It feels almost like an old caretaker, quietly observing, making sure I continue to show respect. I've learned to greet those flickers with a nod, mindful that some echoes linger too long to be silenced without gentle acknowledgement. The local hiker community hears rumors of me venturing into hidden caverns, and they tease me about unearthing new secrets. I just smile, shrugging off questions about hauntings or specters, unwilling to reduce my experiences to mere campfire stories. I remain in the Hocking Hills, finishing my photography series that I plan to publish as a coffee table book celebrating the region's rugged beauty. My cabin is still modest, the off-grid power flickers occasionally, and the damp climate ensures I'm always scrubbing away mold. But I've found a sense of purpose here that city lights never gave me. Sometimes I share tea with a neighbor or chat with weekend hikers about local wildlife. Other times, I roam alone through the forest, camera in hand, letting the hush of the ravines soak into my bones. Late at night, I review my photos on a small laptop that whirs on my rickety solar power. I spot faint anomalies in some shots, strange smudges that might be lens flares or might be something else. A swirl of ectoplasm, a partial silhouette, the echo of a man who once wandered these caves. My rational side says it's just humidity messing with the camera sensor. My heart, though, says it's a reminder. The hermit remains, grateful or at least resigned to my presence, no longer forced to roam in angry sorrow. The forest around my cabin, the dripping cave corridors, and the hush that falls in the deeper hollows all whisper that I've stumbled into a truce with the land's old ghosts. I guess that's the best way to describe it. A truce. I never intended to chase legends or make peace with spirits. I just wanted to photograph nature's silent wonders. But in the process, I learned that some landscapes hold more than silent wonders. They hold secrets, tragedies, restless echoes. And if you want to stay, if you want to claim a corner of that haunted beauty as home, you have to listen, to show humility. I've done my part, scrawling a quiet memorial in a hidden cave, leaving flowers for a sorrow I can't fully comprehend. In return, the hermit's presence no longer stalks me with dread, letting me roam the forests in relative peace. The final photo I snapped of that secret cave now hangs in a small frame by my cabin's front door. It shows a simple plaque and a handful of wilting flowers, water glistening on the stone. People who visit sometimes ask about it, and I only smile, saying it's part of a local story. Maybe, in time, I'll weave it into a short essay for my upcoming book, though I suspect the real story is best kept in the hush of these hills. I am Grace Pennington, a nature photographer who came to Hocking Hills seeking quiet beauty, but found something deeper, a gentle, solemn realm that cradles the memory of old sorrows, offering a place for both the living and the departed to coexist in a wary yet meaningful harmony. I stay because it feels like I'm part of that story now, part of a land that taught me the power of acknowledgement and humility. And each time I step into the cool, damp shadows of those caverns, camera lens glinting in the dim light, I feel a faint stirring behind me, like a whisper of a guide, softly reminding me to tread with care, for the echoes of the past never truly fade in these hidden hollows. I used to think the most haunting sound in the world was a slide guitar wailing a sad note through a beaten amp in some rundown juke joint. Turns out, I was wrong. The most haunting sound is the low, mournful hum of the Mississippi Delta at night when the humidity wraps you up, and there's no one around to share the hush but ghosts. My name is Lonnie Brooks, short for Lionel, though hardly anyone's called me Lionel in years. I spent most of my 20s and 30s as a session guitarist, bouncing between half-formed blues bands around Memphis and New Orleans, chasing the dream that rarely stayed put. When that final band fell apart, thanks to clashing egos and an utter lack of money, I drifted for a while, picking up odd jobs, sleeping on friends' couches. Eventually, the notion of living off-grid in the Delta got under my skin. Maybe it was a romantic idea, the thought of returning to the cradle of blues to find my own redemption. Or maybe I'd just reached a point where I wanted to vanish from the world's expectations. I found a ratty old shack near Clarksdale, maybe 10 miles outside the main drag, in a low patch of land that edged a sluggish bend of the river. The previous occupant had died, no next of kin, so the property was going cheap. You could see the water lines on the siding, a reminder that flooding was as constant as humidity out here. A battered porch drooped in front, its steps half-eaten by termites, and inside, the walls were patched with layers of peeled posters from decades prior. I recognized glimpses of old blues festivals, images of big names who'd once played these parts. It felt like a sign, though I'm not the superstitious type. I had just enough saved up from my years playing backup guitar to buy it outright. People shook their heads, called me crazy for wanting to live out here, said I'd be swamped by mosquitoes and floods. I shrugged, telling them it was exactly what I needed, a place to figure out if I still had any music in me, or if I'd let the city devour whatever spark I'd once possessed. I arrived in the early spring, the air thick with pollen and the sweet scent of honeysuckle. My first impression was that it was too damn quiet. No honking horns or pushy crowds, just the subtle lap of water on muddy banks, a chorus of distant frogs. I inhaled, letting that hush sink into my lungs. Then I inspected the shack more carefully, cussing under my breath at the sagging roof, the rotted timbers under the floor. Off-grid meant I'd rely on a patchy solar array I planned to set up, plus a small generator for emergencies. The nearest store was miles away, so I learned to ration my staples. Some days I'd drive into Clarksdale for fresh produce and the occasional jam session in a local bar. But mostly I stayed put, trying to reclaim that sense of self I'd lost in the chaos of the music scene. The heat and humidity hammered me, especially once we slipped into the early summer. Even in the evenings, I'd sit out on the porch shirtless, the sweat trickling down my back, guitar resting on my lap. I'd strum a bit, chasing the faint echo of old blues licks I'd once played with such confidence. A few times, I'd slip into a smoky groove that almost made me forget I'd turned my back on city life. I started thinking I might record a homegrown album in this shack someday. Maybe a stripped-down set of songs that rang true to the Delta's spirit. But it wasn't long before the weirdness started. One night, I was tuning up my acoustic guitar under the single light I'd rigged to the generator, the river glinting under a sliver of moon. Out of nowhere, I heard a faint guitar chord drifting through the humid air. I froze, straining to figure out if I'd accidentally brushed the strings, but my fingers hadn't moved. Another chord followed, quiet as a whisper, somewhere in the darkness behind the shack. A chill ran through me, though the air was still muggy as hell. I whispered, "Hello." Dumb move, I know, but fear and curiosity spiked together. No answer, just the steady croak of frogs. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself maybe I was hearing an echo of my own playing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't the same progression I'd been strumming. After that, it happened more regularly. I'd be messing around with a new riff on the porch, and then I'd stop, only to hear a few guitar notes trailing off from the shadowed edge of the yard. I'd leap up, shine my flashlight, see nothing but the tall grass and the reflection of the moon in the wet soil. Once, I got the nerve to dash behind the shack, thinking maybe a neighbor or a drifter was messing with me. All I found were footprints in the mud, barefoot impressions leading nowhere, vanishing at the bank. The river was too deep to cross without a boat, so I didn't understand how someone could just disappear. It set my heart thumping. I started sleeping less, worried I'd wake to find someone rummaging around my gear. I asked around in Clarksdale. The old-timers at a local diner gave me cryptic glances when I mentioned hearing phantom guitar chords at night. One or two conjured up stories of an old bluesman named Jeremiah Crooked Eye Davis, who'd vanished from a juke joint decades ago, rumored to have drowned in the Delta after a heated argument with a bandmate. Others talked about a traveling musician who'd been murdered in a land dispute. Nothing solid. But the repeated theme was that the Delta had its share of restless spirits, especially those tied to the music that thrived here. Some folks told me I was probably spooked by loneliness, by the swampy nights that muddled city folks' heads. I couldn't say they were wrong, but I also couldn't ignore the repeated chord progressions that I heard, always sad. Minor blues chords that pricked at my soul like a needle. Then came the dreams. In them, I'd see a tall man with a battered guitar, face obscured by shadow, standing at the water's edge. He'd strum a few notes that echoed with raw anguish. I'd try to speak, but no sound emerged from my dream self's throat. The man would tilt his head, as if beckoning me closer. I'd wake trembling, the humidity pressing against my face, my mouth dry. The next day, I'd catch glimpses in the corner of my eye, a silhouette near the cypress trees, a flicker of movement by my rickety shed. I'd run outside, cursing under my breath, only to be greeted by the stillness of midday heat. I half wondered if maybe I'd found the last straw. The music scene had broken my spirit, and now I'd retreated to a shack that harbored a ghost who'd never gotten a chance to record his final masterpiece. Or maybe my own regrets manifested in the shape of this phantom guitarist. I tried rationalizing. I tried ignoring it. Neither approach worked. The mysterious chords continued, especially on nights when the clouds choked out the moon, leaving the yard cloaked in a sticky, dark fog. One evening, I packed up my gear and headed to Red's Lounge in town, hoping a jam session would quell my nerves. The place was dim, the air thick with cigarette smoke. A couple of local players hammered out a slow, mournful blues. I jumped in with my guitar, letting the music roll through me. For a few hours, I felt that old spark, like the soul I'd lost in the city, was flickering back to life. After we finished, I sipped whiskey with the locals, and when we got to swapping ghost stories, I mentioned my predicament. An older man named Chester eyed me with a knowing sadness. He said, "You got a restless musician out there, or so it sounds. Sometimes they show up for folks who got that same hurt in their hearts. Maybe it wants you to do something. He explained how, years back, people believed if a spirit of a blues man lingered, it might be seeking resolution, an apology, a final performance, or a tribute that would honor its unfulfilled songs. Chester shrugged, disclaiming he wasn't an expert on ghosts, but the idea that the spirit might need some kind of tribute gnawed at me. I recalled how I'd left so many collaborations undone when I abruptly left the city. Maybe the spirit's regret mirrored my own. Or maybe it was simpler. If I wanted peace, I'd have to show respect for the music that had shaped the Delta's soul. The next night, I steeled my nerve. I set up a small altar of sorts on my porch, a battered guitar case as a makeshift table, a candle for light, and one of my few remaining vinyl records of a legendary Delta blues musician. I knelt there under the oppressive heat, the candle flickering, and I spoke into the night. If there's a soul out here that's been wandering, I want you to know I hear you, I said softly. My throat felt tight. I'm no saint, but I want to honor the music that lived in you. I'll play a set for you, right here, under these cypress trees. My own voice shook with the vulnerability of it. Then, feeling half crazy, I lit the candle, placed the record beside it, and cradled my old acoustic guitar. The strings whined under my fingertips. I launched into a slow blues progression, minor chords that moaned with each downstroke, my voice trembling as I sang the lines about heartbreak and yearning. At first, I felt foolish, singing to an empty yard. But as the night deepened, I swear the air changed. The frogs and cicadas hushed. The humidity seemed to cradle my notes rather than smother them. I poured my regrets and worn-out dreams into that performance, letting the chords ring. After 3 or 4 songs, I paused, breath unsteady, half expecting to hear a chord respond from the darkness. For a long moment, there was just the candle's wavering glow. Then, so faint I almost missed it, a single guitar note drifted from the far corner of the yard. One note, followed by another, harmonizing with the chord that still buzzed in my strings. Goosebumps ran down my arms. A tear slid down my cheek. I strummed the chord again, waiting, and the phantom chord answered, as though we were trading licks in a jam session. It was heartbreakingly beautiful in its simplicity. I exhaled a shaky breath and let the final chord fade into the warm night. By the time I blew out the candle, my limbs trembled with exhaustion and awe. Nothing else happened that evening. No swirling apparitions or spectral visions. I just felt a sense of relief, like the weight of unspoken sadness had loosened. For the next week, the nights were peaceful. The scraping at the walls, the spectral chords in the yard, all of it subsided. I was able to sleep with the windows open, letting the faint breeze rustle the curtains. For a while, I believed I'd laid the spirit to rest with that small tribute. Then the Delta gave me another test. A heavy storm system rolled in from the south, bringing relentless rain that turned the yard into a swamp. Water seeped under my shack's door, and I scrambled to save my equipment from rising damp. On the storm's second day, the generator conked out. I was left with just a few flickering lanterns, huddling on my porch as I watched the river swell, creeping dangerously close. Late that night, in the midst of howling wind and sheets of rain, I heard the guitar chords again, a gentle picking, almost drowned by the storm but unmistakably there. Only this time, they sounded calmer, like a lullaby. I stood in the downpour, searching the gloom for a shape, but all I saw was the swirl of rain on the flooded earth. Still, those chords comforted me, as if the spirit was reminding me we were connected in this watery darkness. My fear receded, replaced by an odd sense of companionship. When the storm finally passed, I found that the shack, though battered, still stood. My belongings were damp but salvageable. The yard was a muddy ruin, but it would dry. As I toiled to clear debris, I realized I'd begun whistling that same progression the spirit once played, weaving it into my daily routine. In the evenings, I'd take my acoustic out and pluck a few notes under the starlit sky, half hoping for a ghostly response. Sometimes I'd catch a single chord, or a gentle chord progression echoing back, as if from some distant realm. Each time, I nodded in gratitude. Rumors spread among the handful of neighbors that I'd made peace with the swamp ghost or the restless musician. People teased me about conjuring devils like the old Robert Johnson stories. But in my heart, I knew I wasn't messing with anything demonic. It felt more like a joint lament, a shared sorrow between a living guitarist whose dreams had crashed and a wandering soul that never got to finish its final set. Maybe that's too poetic, but living here in the Delta does something to your perspective. The land is steeped in centuries of sorrow, hope, and unrecorded stories. The music that sprang from here is laced with heartbreak, yet it sustains generation after generation. I remain in that shack, forging a life of quiet routine. My solar array still stutters now and then, but I manage. I patch up the porch, improve the drainage around the yard to lessen flood damage, and plant a small vegetable garden in a raised bed. I still drive into Clarksdale occasionally, jamming with local musicians at a few hole-in-the-wall clubs, but I always come back to the hush of my property. There's a deep solace here, a sense that I'm part of the land's continuum. I've even recorded a handful of new songs on an old 4-track recorder. Songs that blend my old city influences with the slow, mournful heartbeat of the Delta. A few times, as I listened to the playback late at night, I heard an extra chord or note that I didn't recall playing. Maybe it was a glitch, or maybe it was the spirit joining in. I let it be. Strange how quiet can feel oppressive at first, then become comforting when you learn to listen. The Delta's quiet is never truly silent. It's a tapestry of frogs croaking, wind through cypress knees, and a faint, timeless echo of all the souls who've poured their laments into the blues. I figure that if this old shack is to be my home, I owe it a measure of respect. So, each Sunday night, I set up a small lamp and play a short set on my porch, a tribute to the heritage of Mississippi music. Once in a while, I'll catch a single answering chord drift across the yard, so soft I can't be sure it's real, and that's enough for me. A gentle reassurance that my housemate from beyond the veil is still around, no longer angry, but maybe just as lonesome as me. I guess I've found a balance, a simple, off-grid life in a place that fosters both the living and the departed. If someone asked me whether I'm scared, I'd say not so much anymore. Wariness, yes, but the terror has mellowed into an understanding that we share a bond born from broken dreams and the unending sorrow that can shape beautiful music. In the Delta, heartbreak and hope walk hand in hand. I no longer crave the neon swirl of city bars, the constant hustle for gigs. I've discovered a quieter stage. My battered porch under the star-strewn southern sky, the black water glinting, and the rustle of cypress. Sometimes, the best audience is a ghostly chord answering your lonely riff. I'm Lonnie Brooks, a once-lost musician who found his refuge in the Mississippi Delta's hush. The phantom guitarist who haunted my nights, I believe it's a spirit that never got to sing its final note. By offering my own tunes as tribute, I suspect I've become part of its story, or it's become part of mine. And maybe that's what redemption looks like out here. 2 wounded souls, 1 flesh, 1 phantom, sharing a timeless harmony in the damp, haunted nights by the slow-moving waters of the Delta. I used to think I knew a little something about quiet places, about the spaces where the world seems to pause and let you breathe. I thought I understood hush and stillness because I spent so many years chasing interviews in the dead of night, walking deserted city blocks in search of a story no one wanted to tell in daylight. But none of that prepared me for what I found when I moved into the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. My name is Lee Marston, and I was once a journalist who reveled in unearthing secrets. Maybe that thirst for the hidden is what brought me here, though I've grown to wonder if certain places call out to certain people, pulling them into corners of the world they'd never otherwise see. It all started after I quit the paper. I'd gone from chasing political scandals and corruption rackets to feeling like I was drowning in a perpetual swirl of half-truths and deadlines. I wanted out. I wanted to wake up to the sound of wind in trees, not the blare of my phone's alarm. So, in a fit of impulsivity I rarely allowed myself, I searched for cheap properties in areas that offered solitude. When I saw the listing for a small cabin on the edge of the Pine Barrens, miles from the nearest grocery store, with no real neighbors to speak of, it sang a note in my chest. Something about the mention of old pines, sandy soil, and an odd emptiness felt perfect. Before I could second-guess it, I locked in the sail and packed my life into a borrowed truck. I arrived on a gray afternoon in late autumn. The road leading to my new place was little more than a sandy track, and the pine trees that lined it towered overhead, dense and unwavering. The cabin itself was modest, with peeling paint and windows smudged from years of neglect, but it was mine. Or so I told myself with a thrill of equal parts excitement and trepidation. The first few days, I reveled in the simple tasks of making the place livable, scrubbing grime off the walls, installing an old wood stove for heat, and hooking up a ragtag set of solar panels for minimal electricity. The soil was so sandy it refused to hold a decent garden, but that was a future project. For now, I put my focus on a rudimentary routine. Wake up, listen to the hush of wind in the pines, gather firewood, read or write in the afternoons, then watch the sun slip away in the early evening. It felt like a dream, if a lonely one. I'd heard rumors about the Pine Barrens even before I moved, but I was always a skeptic. Stories of the infamous Jersey Devil, sightings of unearthly creatures that left footprints across the sand, and superstitions about certain roads you should never travel after dark. I rolled my eyes whenever people brought it up, especially locals who seemed to relish spinning tall tales for gullible newcomers. As an ex-journalist, I prided myself on cutting through nonsense, yet I never expected the land itself to have such an eerie undercurrent. At night, the forest around me fell into a silence so deep it rang in my ears. No city hum, no passing headlights, just the occasional rustle of an unknown creature stepping over pine needles, or the whoosh of wind carrying the faint scent of resin. Sometimes I'd catch a distant coyote's howl, and in those moments I felt as though I'd drifted into another century, one where the wilderness reigned and humankind was a mere trespasser. Things changed one evening after I'd been there a couple of weeks. It was early November, and darkness fell fast. I'd finished dinner, a can of soup heated on the wood stove, and was reading by a dim LED lamp. The wind outside picked up, rattling the pine branches against each other. A few times I thought I heard something scamper across the porch. Raccoons, I told myself. But a sense of disquiet settled in my stomach, that old reporter's gut instinct telling me something was off. I forced myself to keep reading, but my attention skittered to the door at every creak. Eventually, I gave in to the feeling and went to open the door. The cool air brushed my face, carrying a hint of dryness. The porch seemed empty, lit only by a sliver of moon. I stepped out gingerly, shining a flashlight around. Nothing, just pine needles and the sandy yard. Yet I noticed an odd odor, like sulfur or decaying vegetation. I couldn't place it. Then the wind sighed, and the smell faded. Later that night, I woke abruptly with my heart pounding, certain I'd heard a high-pitched cry. I listened. Nothing. I drifted back to a shallow sleep, only to jolt awake again an hour later at the sound of scraping along the side of the cabin. I jumped out of bed, lunged for the flashlight, and peered out the nearest window. The dark yard offered me no answers. In the morning, I checked the spot where I'd heard the noise, expecting raccoon prints or scratch marks. But what I found almost made me drop the coffee mug in my hand. a line of hoof prints in the sandy soil. Not deer, not the right shape. These prints had a cloven look, yet were spaced as though made by something walking upright on two legs, crossing behind the cabin and continuing into the pines. My immediate thought was that someone was playing a trick on me, forging bizarre prints with a homemade hoof contraption. But who? I had no neighbors within earshot, and pranks seemed a stretch. I snapped a few photos, though part of me felt embarrassed, as if capturing it validated the weirdness. I tried to push the incident aside, but a sense of unease gnawed at me. Over the following days, I noticed other small signs, broken pine branches high off the ground, as if something tall had moved through them, strange patterns in the sand that might have been left by a tail or a dragging limb. My nights were restless, each rustle outside magnified into a potential visitor. I started researching local legends more thoroughly. The Pine Barrens had a deep folklore about a cryptid or devilish entity. Sure, I remembered the broad strokes from my days chasing stories, but immersing myself in the details, the varied sightings, the historical accounts of a monstrous creature, made the hair on my arms stand up. I was convinced it was nonsense. Yet the hoof prints, they wouldn't leave my mind. The more I learned, the more I realized that people had long described discovering hoofed footprints near their homes, hearing odd shrieks at night, or glimpsing a silhouette darting between pines. Some tried to ward it off with crosses, others with salt or repeated prayers. It all struck me as superstition, but fear can make you consider actions you'd once dismissed. I found myself eyeing the windows after sunset, triple-checking the locks on my flimsy door, even though part of me knew that if something truly wanted in, the door would do little to stop it. My rational side still insisted it could be a messed-up deer. The Pine Barrens was known for stunted wildlife, including deer that sometimes looked deformed due to poor nutrition. But deep down, that answer didn't satisfy me. And so, the journalist in me decided to investigate. One crisp morning, I followed the hoof prints from behind the cabin. They led into a stand of pines that thickened after 100 yards, crossing a small clearing. I lost them in the patchy grass, but I found broken branches overhead that seemed to continue in a line, as though something tall had forced its way through. I ventured maybe half a mile, my heart in my throat, scanning the ground for prints, the trunk for scratch marks. Eventually, I stumbled onto a small, half-buried foundation of what might have been an old cabin or shed from a century ago. The structure was almost erased by time, just a few stones and rotted beams. The woods around it felt different, heavier, like the air had gone stale. I caught that odor again, sulfur or decay, and abruptly decided I had seen enough for the day. I retreated, telling myself I'd come back with better gear. I never mustered the courage to do so. That evening, I returned to the local diner I'd frequented a few times, my mind spinning with questions I didn't know how to phrase. Over a burger and watery coffee, I listened to older locals swap rumors about the Barrens. Eventually, I joined their conversation, gently steering it toward cryptids or strange sightings. A leathery-faced man named Norman smirked at me, said, "You come out here from the city. You probably heard all about the Jersey Devil. Might just be imagination." But his eyes flicked away, as though he wasn't as certain as his tone suggested. Another man, Roland, chimed in. "My granddaddy always kept a sprig of cedar by his door. Said it warded off the evil in these woods. Don't know if he believed in devils, but he swore something roamed the pines at night, looking for mischief or worse. I'd have laughed it off once, but the hoof prints were too vivid in my memory. So I discreetly asked how one might live in harmony with this place, if indeed something roamed the forest. Roland shrugged. "Respect the land, keep your head down. Don't go messing around with places that have old curses on them. Some folks burn sage or cedar. Others put iron nails above their doors. Couldn't hurt, right?" I left that diner feeling both silly and determined. If these small gestures put me at ease, then I'd do them. So, the next day, I found a local hardware store, bought some iron nails, and hammered them above my door frame. I gathered cedar branches from the forest edges, bound them in twine, and placed them in corners of my cabin. Maybe it was all symbolic, but it gave me a sense of control in a situation that felt increasingly unhinged. For a few nights, I slept better. No suspicious scraping or midnight shrieks. But then came the event that sealed my conviction that something beyond the ordinary lurked outside. It was a windy night, the pines swaying overhead in a slow, creaking waltz. I'd been dozing off, my small lamp flickering from the unsteady solar supply, when a sudden crash rattled the porch. I jolted upright, adrenaline spiking, and grabbed a flashlight. My hand shook as I opened the door. The wind gusted cold air at me, stinging my cheeks. My porch railing was splintered as though something heavy had collided with it. And there, in the sandy dirt, was another set of hoof prints, deeper than the earlier ones. They circled the porch, then darted off into the trees, leaving broken brush in their wake. The stench of sulfur laced the wind, and I felt a primal dread coil in my stomach. My gaze flicked to the nails above the door. They were intact, but it seemed like whatever was out there had tested me, tested them. I spent the night fully dressed, huddled in the corner of the cabin, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. If the thing returned, I wanted to be prepared, though I had no real plan. By dawn, I was exhausted. Part of me wanted to flee, to accept I'd made a grave mistake moving here. But another part whispered that if I ran, I'd never outrun my own fear. This was the life I'd chosen, to escape the city and find quiet. But I'd found something else along with the quiet, an ancient hush that concealed old, nameless shapes in the pines. Desperate for a sense of calm, I decided on a ritual of my own. I collected cedar boughs, rosemary, and a few protective herbs I'd read about. Then, at twilight, I lit a small fire in a makeshift pit near the front yard. My intention was simple: to claim my presence here peacefully, to let the forest know I acknowledged its old ways. As I fed the herbs into the flames, a fragrant smoke curled upward, blending with the pine-scented air. My voice trembled as I spoke aloud, something about, "I come with respect, wanting to live in these woods without harm." I felt foolish, but also determined. The flames cast dancing shadows on the tree trunks, and for a moment I thought I saw a shape slipping just beyond the firelight. My heart hammered, but I steadied myself, refusing to break the circle of my tiny ritual. When the fire died down, I scattered the ashes near the porch. Then I retreated inside, leaving the door unlatched in a gesture of trust. Though I sat awake for hours, mind churning, the night passed quietly, no crashes or scraping. In the morning, I found the footprints again near the edge of the yard, as if something had come to watch me from a distance, but they didn't approach the cabin. A cautious sense of relief blossomed inside me, though I remained on guard. Over the following weeks, the disturbances eased. No more shattered porch railings. No more bone-chilling shrieks in the wind. Once, I caught faint hoof prints crossing a sandy patch near the old shed, but they continued on, leaving me be. I'd like to say that everything returned to normal, but normal had changed for me. I adjusted to living in a place that might host something unexplainable. The hush of the pine barrens no longer felt wholly empty or benign. It was more like a living tapestry that tolerated my presence. Each day, I strolled among the pines, collecting data for a little personal project about local flora. Each night, I kept an ear open, half expecting a repeat. Whenever the wind blew strongly, I caught a faint whiff of sulfur, yet it never lingered. I hammered extra nails above the windows, stashed cedar branches in the corners, and repeated a small prayer of respect if I sensed the air thickening with that intangible heaviness. Sometimes I daydream about returning to journalism, about writing an exposé on the secrets of the Pine Barrens, but how would I phrase it? ex-reporter claims cryptid visits at night, leaves hoofprints and broken porch railings. It'd raid like a tabloid piece, overshadowing the subtle truth that there's a profound mystery in certain corners of the earth, a living hush that doesn't yield to rational explanation. I decided, in the end, that this is a story best kept in the hush of these pines, shared only in hints with locals who might nod knowingly, or city acquaintances who'd roll their eyes. Winter came, the days turning cold. The pines took on a starker quality, their needles rustling in an almost metallic hiss when the wind snaked through them. The sandy ground froze in patches, cracking underfoot. Occasionally, I woke to a dusting of snow that melted by afternoon. In the new hush of winter, I rarely saw footprints, hoofed or otherwise. I sometimes wondered if the thing had migrated or gone dormant. Maybe it was cyclical, or maybe my attempts at a truce had worked. I kept up my rituals anyway, lighting a small bundle of herbs whenever the air felt too tense, a quiet vow that I intended no harm. If I felt foolish, I remembered the night my porch rail broke, the sense of a primal force testing me, and that kept me dedicated. I remain here, a quiet occupant of the Pine Barrens, forging a life that suits my reclusive soul. The cabin's still small and unassuming, but I've improved it bit by bit, learning to weather the extremes. My phone calls with old friends sometimes turn awkward when they ask about my backwoods existence. They can't imagine the hush that I've grown to respect. I've stopped trying to paint it in words that might trivialize it. Let them believe I'm just living off-grid to save money, or to write my memoir. The deeper truth is that I've found a corner of the world where the boundary between the tangible and the unknown is thin, and that suits me just fine. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'll wake for no apparent reason. I'll slip on a jacket, open the door, and step onto the porch. The pine-scented air greets me, the moon washing the clearing in silver. I'll scan the yard for prints or shapes, though usually it's just the hush of sleeping woods. If I stand there long enough, I start to sense the watchful presence of something old, something that's roamed these barrens long before we staked our claims, but it stays at a distance, letting me exist in my humble domain so long as I maintain respect for it and for the labyrinth of pines that cradle me. I guess that's all I can say. I've learned to live with the land's secrets, the same way you learn to live with the creaks and groans of an old house. You accept that some things aren't meant to be pinned down or exposed. My days revolve around small joys, brewing coffee over a wood stove, reading battered books by lantern light, wandering the pine trails with a notepad, scribbling my thoughts. If an unearthly presence sometimes roams at night, leaving hoofprints in the sand, well, that's part of the tapestry too. We share the hush of these woods, neither of us eager to push the other out. So that's my story. I'm Lee Marston, an analytical ex-journalist who gave up the city chase for a shot at real quiet, only to discover that quiet can hide ancient whispers and hoofprints in the sand. I remain here, drawn by a hush that defies all easy stories, forging a life of cautious coexistence with the Pine Barrens' oldest inhabitant, an inhabitant that I might never see in the harsh glare of day, but whose presence I have felt in every chilled breath of wind, every broken branch, every subtle scrape at the cabin walls that once threatened to rattle my sanity. I stay because this hush, unsettling as it can be, feels more honest than the illusions I chased in the city. Here, at least, I know what truly matters: respect for the hidden, the unknown, and the possibility that some legends walk among us beneath the tall pines, unbound and unbroken by human logic. I remember thinking that a place like Lake Martin must be the closest thing to paradise I'd ever find. The first time I saw it, the water mirrored a wide blue sky. The surrounding pines and oaks reflected on its surface with a clarity that set my heart at ease. I'd driven down from Atlanta, hungry for an escape from the relentless churn of modern life, a place to slow down and reevaluate the path I'd taken. My name is Donovan Pierce, and I was once an architect caught in the gears of endless skyscraper proposals, deadlines that blurred into each other, and a personal life that felt increasingly hollow. When I saw the listing for a modest cabin near Lake Martin, something in me seized on the idea that I could build a simpler existence from its bones, forging a life on my own terms. By the time I arrived to check out the property in person, I'd already combed through the specs. An old one-room cabin, barely enough electricity from a shaky solar setup, and a short path leading to a little dock at the lake's edge. The realtor gave me a look that said she'd seen better places selling for less, but I wasn't there for comfort, exactly. I wanted solitude, a chance to design a structure for myself that embodied function and minimalism, a small, quiet retreat. Standing on the dock that first day, I felt the lake's calm seep into my chest, the smell of warm pine drifting in the sunlight, and I thought, yes, this is where I'll start over. After the sale, I packed my life into a borrowed trailer, hauling a meager set of possessions and enough tools to salvage the existing cabin. The first time I set foot inside my new home, I had to fight through a tangle of old cobwebs and flick away the startled lizards that had taken up residence. The space was Spartan, with a stove in one corner, the bed frame in another, and a single grimy window facing the lake. The interior walls were scuffed, and the floor squeaked under my weight. Still, I saw its potential, saw how, with a little patience, I could transform it into a sanctuary. The realtor had left me with a half smile and a cryptic remark about weird rumors, but I'd brushed it off as local lore or gossip from bored neighbors. If only I'd known how prescient that half-smile was. I expected the usual off-grid struggles, wrestling with a small solar array that frequently sputtered, or a roof that needed patching to hold off the Alabama rains. And, yes, those tasks kept me busy at first. But I was unprepared for the intangible sense of unease that tiptoed in around the edges of my new life. It started with small moments of discomfort, like a faint tingle at the back of my neck when I stood on the dock at dusk, or an odd hush that fell over the shoreline, even as the rest of the lake's waters teemed with fish and the occasional boat. Lake Martin was known for its mild breezes, so the pockets of still air that settled around my dock in the evening unsettled me. The first real sign that something was off came on a warm afternoon as I was setting up a secondary water pump near the dock. I'd wanted a more reliable way to draw lake water for chores. Squatting beside the water, I fiddled with a stubborn fitting, cursing under my breath at the shoddy clamp. Suddenly, I felt a chill, an inexplicable breeze that rippled over my arms despite the midday heat. I paused. The lake's surface stretched out calm and glossy, and not a single leaf rustled overhead. I glanced around, half expecting a cloud had drifted across the sun, but no, the sun still burned bright above me. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed something, a pale glimmer beneath the water's surface just out of reach. I leaned closer, heart picking up speed, and saw only my own reflection. Shaking my head, I resumed my work, but a subtle anxiety clung to my thoughts. That night, as I tried to doze off in the squeaky bed, I heard what sounded like a faint knocking at the window, as if a gentle finger tapped the glass. It was around 1 a.m, and the forest outside lay in near total darkness. I held my breath, waiting to see if it would repeat. Nothing, just my own pulse thudding in my ears. After a minute, I told myself it must have been a stray branch or maybe a bat fluttering by. Still, my sleep was fitful, plagued by odd, watery dreams. Days slipped into a routine of hauling materials, measuring the cabin for modifications, sketching out potential expansions. I was determined to modernize the place without losing its rustic charm. Every so often, I'd take the rowboat out for a spin across the lake, letting the tranquil waters lull me into a serene state. But once, as I rowed at dusk, the sun's final rays sinking behind the distant hills, I felt that chill again. My arms froze mid-stroke. The lake was glass-like, a faint orange glow reflecting. Then I saw movement in the corner of my vision, a swirl of water that might have been a fish or a drifting log. Yet it moved with a strange grace, almost like a figure gliding below the surface, pale arms outstretched. I jerked my head to get a better look, but it vanished. My heart hammered. Could have been a trick of light, I reasoned, or the reflection of clouds. That night, I couldn't get the image out of my mind. The shape under the water, an almost human silhouette drifting in the lake's silent depths. I tried to laugh at my own paranoia. Too many horror flicks, I joked to myself. The next morning, I found the boat's oar resting on the dock, even though I was pretty sure I'd left it inside the boat. A small oversight, maybe. But these little discrepancies kept piling up. I began to poke around for local history, half to satisfy the curiosity that had once driven me as an architect doing historical restorations, half to quell my uneasy nights. Lake Martin was known for its recreational appeal, but digging deeper, I found mention of a few tragedies over the years. People who drowned, boats that capsized unexpectedly. Not unusual for a large body of water, I told myself. Yet, I kept stumbling on rumors of a young woman who disappeared decades ago, rumored to have drowned near an inlet, though her body was never recovered. Some retellings turned it into a love story gone wrong. Others made it a cautionary ghost tale. The details were fuzzy, no official record that matched precisely, but mention of her name surfaced occasionally. Karina or Corinne. Nobody seemed certain. Locals recounted glimpses of a pale figure gliding near the shoreline, especially around twilight. Most rolled their eyes at it, passing it off as folklore. But my midnight tapping and that swirl in the water left me less inclined to dismiss it. A few more weeks passed. My renovations progressed. I installed a more stable solar rig, and I even built a modest shed for tools near the water. Yet the sense of living on borrowed time in this place only grew. One muggy night, I sat on the dock, a single lantern flickering by my feet, the moon shrouded by clouds. I was thinking about the next day's projects, trying to soak in the quiet. Then I heard a whisper, a single breathy note that drifted from the lake, almost like someone sighing my name, Donovan. At first, I froze, convinced I'd imagined it. But then it came again, subtle, as though carried by the light breeze. Every hair on my neck prickled. I jumped up, scanning the rippling water. Nothing but shadow and reflection. I called out, feeling ridiculous. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. My lantern guttered in a sudden gust of wind that shouldn't have existed on such a calm night. I fled inside, my chest tight. Shortly after, I dreamt of a woman standing on the shore in a long, dripping gown, her hair trailing into the water. She reached out for me, her eyes filled with sorrow. I woke, sweaty and shaken. The memory of the dream burned into my mind. Over breakfast, I told myself I'd become unhinged, letting the lake's gloom seep into my psyche. Or maybe I'd eaten something questionable. But the next day, I found wet footprints on the dock in the early morning, small, barefoot prints leading from the water to a spot near the cabin, then back again. The sight hammered home the impossibility of the situation. I took pictures with my phone. The footprints were definitely human, smaller than an adult male's. They glistened in the dawn light, steadily evaporating in the warmth. I felt a wave of disbelief, followed by dread. If it was a prank, it was awfully consistent. If not a prank, I didn't know how to finish that thought. Haunted was a word that curled around my mind, unbidden. I'd never believed in ghosts. But that evening, I found myself scouring the local folklore once more, reading about restless spirits attached to bodies of water, stories told of curses, lost souls seeking closure. The details varied, but the theme was consistent. Sometimes the dead linger near the place where their life ended, manifesting as gentle calls or illusions beneath the surface. For the first time in my life, I considered performing some kind of ritual, just to see if I could put a spirit to rest. Yet I felt out of my depth. Eventually, desperation drove me to a local shop that sold antiques and knickknacks. The owner was a middle-aged woman named Pam, who, upon hearing a slightly sanitized version of my experiences, nodded gravely. She confided that she'd grown up hearing stories of a young woman drowning in Lake Martin after her fiancé jilted her. Pam couldn't confirm if the details matched my location, but she suggested I bring flowers or something personal to the lakeside at twilight, reciting a prayer of peace. She gave me a few stale-smelling candles, old pamphlets describing how to make an offering. It might help, she said, or it might not, but I figure it's better than ignoring it. I felt half silly that evening as I knelt at the shore, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand, a candle flickering by the water's edge. The sky was bruised with the colors of dusk, and my breath turned shallow each time the water lapped near my feet. Softly, I spoke, uncertain how to begin. If there's a spirit here, I'm sorry for your pain. I don't want to intrude. I offer these flowers in memory of what you lost. May you find peace. My voice quivered, but I pressed on. I laid the flowers on the water, letting them drift away, and lit the candle. It wobbled, threatened by the faint breeze. Then I sat in silence, the hush broken only by crickets and the gentle ripple against the shore. For a moment, nothing happened. My chest felt tight with anticipation, or fear, or maybe both. Then I sensed a subtle shift in the air, a faint drop in temperature that made me shiver despite the summer warmth. The lake's surface shimmered. I stared, eyes wide, and glimpsed a shape just below the water, pale, almost luminous. My heart pounded. It rose closer to the surface. Then, in a flash, it vanished. I let out a ragged breath, uncertain if I'd truly seen something or if my mind had conjured it. But the next morning, when I walked the shoreline, there were no wet footprints, no sign of disturbance. The oppressive sense of being watched receded. After that night, I slept better. For 2 weeks, the tapping at my windows ceased. My days returned to normal. Methodical progress on the cabin, a sense of calm on the dock. I even felt comfortable taking the rowboat out under a bright midday sun, gliding across the water without a lingering dread. I told myself that maybe the ritual had worked, that the spirit had accepted my small offering of empathy and left me alone. Then, at the end of August, the calm shattered. A summer storm roared in without much warning, thrashing the lake into choppy waves under a darkened sky. I hunkered inside, hoping my newly repaired roof would hold. Thunder shook the windows, and lightning painted the cabin walls in eerie flashes. In the midst of that chaos, I heard a pounding at the door, urgent, frantic. My stomach lurched. Who would be out here in the midst of a violent storm? I snatched my flashlight and flung the door open to greet swirling rain and wind. No one stood there, just the black silhouette of pine trees bending in the gale. Rain pelted my face. Another knock came, but this time from the back window. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. The lightning flared, revealing an empty yard behind the cabin. A watery reflection blurred across the glass. My heart hammered so violently I thought I might faint. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and pressed my back to the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The storm roared overhead, and a flash of lightning illuminated the interior, enough for me to see the shadows dancing across the floor. My reflection hopped from the window to the corner, and I realized I wasn't alone. Something flickered in the mirror I'd hung near the front, just for convenience. A figure, faint, dripping wet, with eyes that seemed to hold endless sorrow. I gasped. The image vanished with the next flash of lightning. The air felt impossibly cold. I thought I heard a whisper, a single word or name I couldn't decipher. Summoning what courage I had, I whispered, I'm sorry, not sure who I was apologizing to. Outside, the wind shrieked. Then the presence lifted, and I was alone with the storm's raging fury. When dawn came, the storm retreated, leaving branches strewn across my yard. The lake was calmer, though still churned and muddy from the night's onslaught. I ventured outside, trembling to find muddy footprints trailing along the side of the cabin, half washed away by rain. They led to the water's edge, then vanished. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, too unsettled to continue my building tasks. By late afternoon, the sun re-emerged, as if mocking my terror with a bright, warm glow. That evening, I performed another offering, a simple set of wildflowers, a heartfelt apology whispered at the dock, and a vow to honor whatever spirit lingered in these waters. This time, I wasn't just going through the motions. I believed, wholeheartedly, that a spirit of a drowned soul wandered near my cabin, craving acknowledgement. I poured out my empathy, speaking of how I too had come here seeking solace, how I meant no disrespect. Though tears pricked my eyes, I felt a gentle warmth, as if a hidden presence accepted my words. The next morning, the lake surface greeted me with perfect stillness, like polished glass. In that reflection, I almost thought I saw a faint figure standing beside me, not menacing, but watchful. Then it was gone. A peaceful hush clung to the place for days after. I remain here. My off-grid cabin has transformed from a battered hovel into a modest but comfortable home. I installed new windows that frame the lake's beauty, and the roof no longer leaks with every drizzle. I've come to appreciate the slow rhythms of Lake Martin, its brilliant dawns, the shimmering midday heat, the quiet hush at dusk. Sometimes I catch a glimpse in the corner of my eye, a shape drifting near the dock, or the echo of a whisper on the wind. Yet the fear has subsided into a solemn understanding. I believe the spirit, likely that drowned young woman or some echo of her longing, has accepted my presence, and in turn, I honor hers. Now and then, I leave fresh flowers on the shore or hum a gentle tune at sunset. I can't explain why it helps, only that it does. Friends from my old life in the city occasionally text, asking if I've lost my mind out here. I offer them half-truths. It's peaceful. I'm designing my own living space. It's good for my mental health. I don't mention ghostly apparitions or watery footprints. They wouldn't understand how a place can be both haunting and healing at once. But I know that Lake Martin holds secrets in its depths, and those secrets weave themselves into the soul of anyone who lingers too long. The cabin is my refuge, and though I share it with a presence beyond my comprehension, I feel oddly at ease. We coexist, me in my mortal shell, her in the quiet ripples beneath the moonlight. Sometimes, especially on calm nights, I'll stand on the dock, letting the breeze brush my face. The water laps gently, and a faint shimmer crosses the lake's surface. I think I sense her then, the wraith, the drowned soul, standing just below, watching me with neither malice nor warmth, but with a sadness I can't fully fathom. And in those moments, I whisper a greeting, letting her know I haven't forgotten. I can't say if it brings her any relief, but it soothes the subtle ache in my own heart, an ache that stems from the life I abandoned, and the fresh start that remains uncertain. That's enough for me. One day, perhaps, the spirit will fade, moving on to wherever restless souls find rest. Or maybe she'll remain as an echo, drifting through the waters for centuries to come. As for me, I'll keep living by the lake's edge, designing expansions to my humble cabin, fishing for my supper, learning the delicate harmony of daylight and dusk. If the hush is sometimes broken by a soft, sorrowful presence that lingers in the moonlit swells, that hush is also what reminds me that life is a fragile, mysterious gift. We can't claim to know all the reasons behind what we see or sense, but we can learn to make peace with them. And so I do, every dawn, every twilight, standing by the water, offering my quiet reverence to a place that has taught me humility, wonder, and the subtle power of a spirit that's never quite departed. I left behind the fluorescent hum of the library archives on a cold, rainy afternoon, stuffing my last box of well-worn paperbacks and personal knickknacks into the trunk of a battered sedan. My name is Jacob Wells, and for most of my adult life I was a librarian in a mid-sized city, caretaking shelves of dusty volumes and chasing the quiet of the reading room. But years of flickering overhead lights and the endless hush of climate-controlled hallways left me wanting a different kind of silence, one shaped by wind through pines rather than the mechanical buzz of ventilation ducts. I found an old listing for a rundown cabin in the Kiamichi Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma, miles from anything that resembled civilization, and it called to me like a half-remembered dream. Maybe it was a reckless choice, or maybe it was inevitable. Either way, I cashed in my small savings, loaded up the car, and turned my back on the city's smog for the thick forest of an unfamiliar land. The Kiamichi Mountains, I discovered, weren't towering peaks, but rugged ridges blanketed in oak and pine that tapered into dense valleys. Narrow roads twisted through stands of cedar, leading me ever deeper into the hush I craved. By the time I spotted the cabin, a small silhouette perched by a slope of trees half hidden by brambles, the sun was slipping behind the ridges. The structure looked ready to collapse, the porch sagging at one corner, the roof patched with mismatched shingles. A single window faced west, fogged by grime and time. The realtor had warned me that repairs were essential if I wanted to survive even one winter, but I brushed that aside in my eagerness to start fresh. My first night was a jolt of reality. Even though I'd toted in a few solar panels to power basic lights and charge my phone, the place was drafty, the wind sneaking in through cracks in the walls. Outside, darkness fell swiftly, a blackness so complete that my small lantern barely cut through it. The forest beyond the porch felt endless, as though the entire world ended at the tree line. But as the hours ticked past, a strange sense of peace uncoiled in my chest. That first evening, I stepped outside with a coat draped over my shoulders, letting the wind carry the calls of distant owls. The sky, uncluttered by city glow, arced overhead with 1,000 stars. For a moment, I breathed in the scent of damp leaves and pine resin, feeling the city's residue flake off my mind. I thought, this is it, the quiet I've been chasing. Morning brought a new set of challenges. The cabin's interior needed more than a dusting. It needed a full gut job. Half the floor beams rotted from years of moisture. My kitchen was little more than a corner where I could rig a camp stove. There was no running water, but I found a narrow creek about 100 yards down the slope, its trickling flow hidden by thick undergrowth. My plan was to rig a small pump and filter system eventually, once I'd stabilized the cabin's structure. None of this daunted me as much as I thought it might. I'd come here for a new life, after all, and the work felt honest and tangible, far different from the sterile hush of the library, where I'd flip through books that others wrote. Now I was living a story of my own, or so I told myself. That sense of optimism carried me through the first days. Then, on the fourth evening, I began to notice something, footsteps that seemed to echo mine, only half a beat behind. The first time it happened, I was making my way from the cabin to the creek at dusk, a large jug in hand. I'd step on a patch of gravel, hear the crunch, then, half a second later, an identical crunch from somewhere behind me. I paused, swiveling around. The trees stood silent, no obvious shape or movement. I chalked it up to a delayed echo or maybe a small deer mirroring my path out of curiosity. But once I filled the jug and turned back, it happened again. My footfall, then the faint, echoing footfall, as though another traveler walked a few yards behind. My scalp prickled, yet I reasoned it away. The forest had a knack for playing tricks on new ears. Over the next week, I labored from sunrise to sunset, reinforcing beams under the cabin, installing a better lock on the door, and clearing brambles that threatened to swallow the porch. At night, I studied the handful of books I'd saved from my old job, flipping through regional history, or half-heartedly sketching a blueprint for the cabin's eventual remodel. But always, I felt the forest pressing close. Sometimes I'd stare out the window at twilight, certain I saw a shape between the pines, tall and motionless. When I mustered the courage to go check, flashlight in hand, I found only emptiness and the faint rustle of wind among branches. Curiosity burned. So, one evening in the local feed and supply store, I asked the cashier, an older woman with a wry smile, if anyone else lived near me. She gave me a funny look. Not close by, no. Guess old Sam might be a mile or two down the ridge. Why, you got visitors? I shrugged, saying I heard footsteps. Or maybe I was spooking myself. Her expression grew guarded. You be careful up there. People talk about strange happenings in those deeper woods. Some folks blame the spirit that roams the Kiamichi Range, a sort of guardian turned bitter after the land was mistreated. Old story. Could be nonsense, but I'd keep an eye out. She rang me up for nails and a tin of coffee, leaving me with more questions than answers. The footsteps continued. Usually it was at dusk, though not always. I'd trek down the slope for water or gather kindling, and the echoing crunch followed at a distance. I tried doubling back, hoping to catch my silent companion. Never succeeded. Once or twice I found footprints in the soft dirt behind my cabin. Long, narrow impressions, almost human but not quite right. The toe shape seemed elongated, and the spacing suggested something that walked with uncanny grace. A new tension wove itself into my daily routine. My breakfasts tasted stale with worry. My nights were a staccato of half-sleep. Yet I refused to run. Instead, I confronted the dark each evening, stepping onto the porch with a lantern, scanning the tree line for any sign. More often than not, I saw nothing, heard only the skitter of a squirrel or the hoot of an owl. But from time to time, that prickle at my neck told me I wasn't alone. One morning, I decided to push deeper into the forest behind the cabin, see if I could find a clue, a footprint trail, broken branches, or the remains of an old settlement. The Kiamichi region had its share of old native paths and hunting grounds. I'd read in one of my library's archives that certain ridges were sacred to local tribes, places they avoided after certain events. If the cashier's mention of a guardian turned bitter had roots in indigenous lore, maybe I'd glean some context. So I grabbed a day pack with water, my phone, and a small camera, and ventured into the pines. The land sloped up, dotted with outcroppings of rock. Under the canopy, the thinned, turning the ground a dappled tapestry of shadow. After maybe an hour, I found a faint trail, possibly made by deer, winding between thick stands of oak. Following it felt like stepping to another world. The hush grew deeper, my own breath echoing in my ears. Then, near a rocky ledge, I found footprints in the damp soil, long, narrow, pressed deep as though from a heavy step, and fresh enough that leaves hadn't blown over them. My pulse kicked up. I snapped a few photos, heart pounding. That same elongated toe shape. A sinking realization hit me. I was quite far from the cabin, alone, and evidently near the territory of whatever left these prints. For a moment, an irrational fear gripped me, the sense that I was trespassing on sacred ground. Summoning courage, I pressed on just a bit further, enough to see if the prints led to something. They wound up the slope, then vanished on rocky ground. No sign of a campsite or structure, just a wide clearing where the wind sighed in the pines. As I stood there, a wave of cold air brushed across the clearing, making me shiver in the midday sun. I can't explain the dread that followed, but I turned on my heel and hurried back, half stumbling over roots. I felt watched, though no eyes met mine. By the time I returned to the cabin, my shirt was soaked in sweat and my hands trembled. The rest of the day passed in a fog as I tried to rationalize the footprints. A mutated bear? A local hermit wearing odd footwear? My ex-librarian brain demanded a logical explanation, but none of the puzzle pieces fit neatly. That night, the footsteps were louder, each crunch or snapping twig behind me as I moved from the porch to the shed. I spun around, brandishing a flashlight, but the beam caught only swirling dust in the gloom. My heart hammered, fear and frustration tangling in my gut. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing among the trees. Silence. Then a low hiss or growl in the distance. I stumbled back inside, locking the door, gripping a hammer as if it were a sword. In the darkness, shadows danced across the windows. I told myself it was the movement of branches, but the fear refused to subside. At dawn, I woke from dreams of a twisted figure prowling around my cabin. Determined not to give in to terror, I hopped into my car and drove to a local diner for breakfast. I cornered a couple of older farmers trying to glean any insight. One, a man named Hal, shook his head. "You're living up near the old ridge folks talk about, right? Rumors of a Wendigo-like presence, if you believe such. Some say it was once a protector spirit for the tribe that lived there, but after the tribe was forced out or betrayed, the spirit turned malevolent. You want my advice? Show respect and don't go provoking it. These mountains have a long memory." My mouth went dry. Another voice in my head insisted it was just legend, but my experiences had started to blur the line between myth and reality. I had to do something. I wasn't about to run away from a place I'd staked my future on, so I decided to attempt a gesture of respect. Growing up, I'd read about how some communities in other regions left offerings or performed small rituals to appease local spirits. My knowledge was patchy, but I gathered a handful of sage, a small iron charm I'd purchased from a local craftsman, and set them on a flat rock near the cabin's edge. I stood there at twilight, the sky bruised purple and gold, and softly spoke. "I mean no harm to these lands. If you are a guardian, I ask for peace between us. I will treat the forest with care. Let me dwell here without fear." My hands shook slightly with each word. The wind picked up, rustling the pines overhead. For a moment, I thought I caught a flicker of movement at the tree line, tall, gaunt, but it faded with the shifting shadows. The next morning, the sage bundle was gone. The iron charm remained, but the sage had vanished. No wind that night, so it wouldn't have blown away. My heart leapt. Maybe something had accepted the offering. Over the next few days, the footsteps receded, replaced by a watchful hush. I still felt uneasy, like a guest under scrutiny, but no longer stalked at every turn. I found the courage to walk to the creek without hearing that mocking echo of footsteps behind me. At night, I sometimes glimpsed a silhouette near the pines, but it didn't approach. It lingered, as though monitoring me. I swallowed my fear, forcing myself to greet it with a soft nod if I saw it, even if it was just a trick of the light. Weeks passed. The crisp air of late fall arrived, painting the leaves in gold and red. I worked tirelessly on the cabin, reinforcing walls, insulating the floors, installing a basic wood stove for the impending chill of winter. My phone calls to old colleagues grew rarer. It was easier to live in the moment here, forging new daily rhythms, than to explain my life to people who couldn't fathom the hush of these mountains. And yes, I took care never to pollute the forest, burying my trash or hauling it out to proper disposal. I scouted only for deadwood instead of cutting living trees. I felt as though every respectful action was an unspoken pact with the presence that roamed the ridges. One late afternoon, as I strolled along a path behind the cabin, I found a freshly killed deer lying in the brush. Its body was largely untouched except for a single slash across its flank. No typical predator kills had such precision. An eerie sense overcame me, like a demonstration or a sign, the presence telling me the forest's law. Nervous, I retreated to the cabin, leaving the carcass for nature's cycle. By morning, the deer was gone, dragged off or consumed, leaving only a few scattered bones. I forced the image from my mind, trusting my vow to remain a respectful tenant of the land. Then winter arrived in earnest. Snow dusted the ridges, turning the pines into silent sentinels. My little cabin groaned under the weight of wind-blown drifts, but I kept the stove burning and the roof cleared. The hush was deeper than ever. Rarely did I see footprints now, human, animal, or otherwise. Yet at dusk, I still sensed that intangible watchfulness, like a single eye scanning the cabin from behind a curtain of trees. The footsteps, that echo of movement, rarely disturbed me unless I ventured too far into the deeper hollows. Once, searching for kindling, I heard them again, soft crunches of snow behind me, halting when I stopped. My heart seized with panic, but I whispered, "I won't harm your domain," and eventually the footsteps melted away, leaving me trembling but unhurt. I remain here, forging a life that's oddly peaceful despite the echoes of an unseen presence. Some nights, sipping tea by the stove, I recall the halogen glare of library lights, the musty smell of old tomes, and the quiet desperation that spurred me to leave. This hush is different, earthy, primeval. I can't say I'm never afraid, but fear has become a companion, a reminder that I share these ridges with something ancient, shaped by a betrayal older than my knowledge. If the spirit or Wendigo-like guardian once protected this land, it has reason to be wary of intruders. My vow stands. I live gently, mindful of my footprint, mindful of the hush that precedes the soft crunch of an unseen step. People back in the city, if they even remember me, would never believe I tiptoe around a myth. But out here, the myth feels as tangible as the pine needles that crunch underfoot. Sometimes I still catch glimpses, dark silhouettes cutting across the tree line at dusk, a flash of elongated limbs in my peripheral vision. Yet no harm comes to me. I've grown to think of it as a fragile truce. I remain a tenant in the Kiamichi's domain, thankful for each quiet dawn. Perhaps if I stay respectful, keep the land's hidden rules, I'll be allowed to remain. That's enough for me. Sometimes, at the edge of sleep, I recall the footsteps that once echoed mine in the twilight, the rasp of breath that fluttered on the wind, the footprints in the damp soil shaped like neither bear nor man. The memory is a humbling chord. It reminds me that the hush I yearned for is a living thing, brimming with old secrets, not the sterile quiet of a city library. In the hush of these pines, every step reverberates, and if you listen close enough, you might hear a second step behind you, ensuring you never forget whose land you walk upon. I suppose that's the moral of my new life. There is quiet here, but it's a quiet that demands humility, a hush that watches and judges. Day by day, I live in sync with it, forging a cautious harmony. I still harbor a flicker of curiosity about the spirit's full story, the betrayal that twisted its purpose, but perhaps I'll never learn the details. Maybe that's for the best. One must accept certain mysteries to find one's place in this world. Winter's nearly ended now. The mild southeastern Oklahoma spring on the horizon. My cabin stands firmer. The improvement's a testament to my labor and determination. The morning sun is warm on the porch where I sip my coffee. A gentle wind ripples the trees, and I imagine the spirit drifting between trunks, unseen yet always near. I bow my head in greeting, silent as a prayer. Life goes on in measured steps. I read old books by lamplight, gleaning parallels between ancient legends and my own strange predicament. And each day, the hush wraps around me, a paradox of peace and muted fear, teaching me what it truly means to live off-grid in a land that doesn't easily forgive intruders. I am Jacob Wells, once a librarian, now a reluctant occupant of the Kiamichi Mountains. If you ask me whether the stories about a Wendigo-like guardian are true, I'd say yes. in the way that wind is real or heartbreak is real, an unseen force shaping these ridges as sure as the geology beneath. My footprints mingle with its own, yet we keep our distance, a mutual respect earned through caution and humility. And in that fragile equilibrium, I've discovered a deeper understanding of quiet than I ever found in the hush of library aisles. Here, the hush is alive, carrying every footstep that ever crossed these pines, reminding me that silence can cradle both awe and dread in its softly beating heart. I sometimes think back to the moment I decided I'd trade my cramped apartment in the city for a rundown bungalow in the Catskills. It was a muggy August night, my window unit rattling in vain against the heat, and I'd been pacing the living room listening to the ceaseless rumble of traffic. Half my friends thought I was losing it when I mentioned wanting to move to the mountains. The other half shrugged, as if they'd expected this restlessness in me all along. My name is Riley King, and I'm not sure if I'd call myself impulsive or simply hungry for the hush of nature. But 2 weeks after that humid evening, I found myself winding up a narrow road in upstate New York, my car overloaded with mismatched furniture, and a hope that life could be simpler, calmer, more real once I reached the Catskills. The bungalow I bought was advertised as a rustic summer retreat near Phoenicia, though it hadn't seen a real occupant in years. The property had once been part of a larger camp or resort, now long defunct. I recall stepping out of my car that first day, gazing at the scruffy yard of tall grass and wildflowers. Beyond it, the mountains loomed in soft blues and greens, the sky overhead a deeper shade of summer that felt infinite. The bungalow itself showed its age, paint peeling, gutters sagging, a porch whose boards squeaked ominously when I ventured across them. But I sensed a charm hidden beneath the grime, as if the building exhaled a tired welcome, relieved that someone cared enough to rescue it from further decay. I spent the early weeks in a routine of basic survival and slow transformation. By day, I cleared out debris, patched up the roof, and swept layers of dust off the floors. By dusk, I usually sank into a lawn chair in the overgrown yard, watching fireflies flicker against a backdrop of pines. The hush soothed me more than I'd anticipated. No horns blaring, no neighbors pounding on the walls, just a gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional cricket. Sometimes I'd catch a faint breeze rolling down from the mountains, smelling of pine resin and earth. The quiet felt both immense and comforting, like I'd wandered onto a stage set just for me. But it wasn't long before I began noticing a subtle current beneath that quiet, a feeling that the land carried memories I hadn't been told. On my second weekend, I decided to explore the property line. A narrow path led through a row of maples, then twisted downhill toward an open clearing flanked by briars. As I parted the tangles, I stumbled upon a sight that made me pause. A cluster of old playground equipment, rusted swings, a broken seesaw, even a small merry-go-round half sunk into the ground. Grass had grown up around it, vines looping around the metal bars. It looked like it had once been the heart of a children's summer camp, now abandoned to the passage of time. A breeze tugged at the squeaky swing chains, producing a soft, forlorn sound. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I pictured kids shouting and laughing, their voices echoing across the clearing. But that was decades ago, obviously. The metal seat of a swing was so rusted, I worried it would crumble if I touched it. I felt a pang of melancholy, as though I'd stumbled onto the remains of someone else's joy. The air around the playground felt strangely thick, like an echo of lost laughter lingered there. I shivered, though the day was warm. That night, I kept thinking about the old swings. Around midnight, a dream took me. Children running through that clearing, calling out in overlapping giggles. Their forms were hazy, as if half-formed by my own imagination. I woke with my heart pounding. It's not that the dream was terrifying, just vivid and laced with an undercurrent of sorrow I couldn't quite place. I tried telling myself I was letting my new environment seep into my subconscious, but then the odd noises started. Late one evening, as I sat on the bungalow's porch reading by lantern light, I heard what sounded like faint laughter drifting from the direction of that old playground. It was so soft, I wasn't certain if I'd imagined it. I set aside my book, listened harder, heart pounding. The laughter came again, just a brief trill before quiet resumed. No wind, no nighttime hikers wandering by, just that snippet of giggle that had no business in a deserted backyard. I tried to rationalize. Maybe animals or an echo from some campsite in the hills, but logic didn't soothe the goosebumps prickling my arms. I closed up the bungalow early that night, double-checking the doors, feeling oddly vulnerable. The next morning, I forced myself to visit the clearing again, determined not to let fear control me. The swings remained still, the seesaw canted at an angle. Nothing out of place except for a single child's shoe perched on the merry-go-round. Small, faded pink, the sole partly peeled away. My stomach twisted. I was sure that shoe wasn't there before. Gingerly, I picked it up, half expecting it to crumble. Instead, it felt damp, as though it had been left out overnight. My first impulse was that some local kids had found the clearing and decided to spook me. But the shoe looked old, the kind sold years ago, sun-bleached and worn. I tossed it aside, unsettled. The wind sighed through the trees, a gentle hush that made the swing chains give a quiet rattle. The possibility of a haunting or restless spirits hovered at the edges of my thoughts. I scoured the small local library for any mention of a camp or tragedy. They had records of a summer camp that closed in the 1970s, rumored to have lost funding. I found no mention of missing children or catastrophic events, just a blank end date. Yet the clerk gave me a curious look when I asked, reminding me that local rumors claimed a child had died in an accident there, though the official records never confirmed it. She advised me to stay away from the old grounds. They say the place resonates with kids who never left, she whispered, half laughing, half serious. I shrugged, unsettled but not ready to accept ghost stories without more evidence. Back at the bungalow, the nights grew stranger. Sometimes I'd wake in the small hours to the faint sense of someone outside the window, or I'd hear what sounded like a ball bouncing. Once, I heard a clear, high-pitched giggle that made my blood run cold. Throwing on a jacket, I rushed out with a flashlight, scanning the yard. Nothing stirred, except the reflection of my own frantic beam on the windows. In the morning, I'd find footprints, tiny, childlike imprints in the damp soil near the porch, leading away toward the playground. My rational brain tried to conjure an explanation. Pranksters, stray kids from another property. But I found no real evidence of neighbors. The bungalow was the only building on that old site. All other cabins or structures from the defunct resort had collapsed or been dismantled, leaving only this small corner of a vanished world. Tension mounted inside me. The hush I craved began to carry an uneasy weight, as if the mountains pressed in with secrets. I started checking the clearing daily, sometimes finding small signs. A toy soldier left on the seesaw, a chipped porcelain doll's head perched in the grass. Each item looked old, caked with dirt and time. The air around the swings felt thicker each time I visited, a stifling sensation that squeezed my chest. Once, I convinced myself I glimpsed a child's silhouette on the edge of my vision, short, hair in pigtails, vanishing the moment I turned my head. Shaken, I confided in a local bar owner after I'd spent a sleepless night huddled in my bungalow, listening to phantom giggles swirl in the yard. She responded with a sympathetic tilt of her head, telling me rumors of the old playground's haunts. She said townspeople occasionally dared each other to go there at night, claiming you might see ghostly children playing, their laughter echoing through the trees. The official story was that after the camp shut down, the area fell into disrepair, and a few kids who'd tried exploring decades later got spooked by strange sightings. "If you ask me," she said, "the land wants to be remembered. Those kids' memories linger, or maybe an accident tied their spirits to that place." It was a lot to swallow for someone who'd always rolled her eyes at ghost stories, but the evidence was piling up. Footprints, laughter, the inexplicable objects. Part of me thought I should flee, find a more conventional property, but I was too stubborn, or maybe too enthralled by the puzzle. I decided to try an approach reminiscent of the local lore I'd read about, a small memorial or offering to calm restless spirits. So, one dusk, I carried a bouquet of wildflowers, a candle, and a short note I scribbled that read, "I acknowledge what happened here. May you find peace." I set them on the seat of the rusted seesaw. My hands trembled. The air felt heavy, silent enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. I stepped back, unsure if I should speak out loud, but eventually whispered, "I'm sorry if you were hurt here. I don't want to disturb you. I hope this can bring you some rest." The hush thickened, as though the forest held its breath. I stood for a long minute, waiting. Then a breeze rustled the grass, spinning the seesaw just enough that the flowers slid slightly across the metal. A faint giggle, or maybe the wind's trick, passed on the edge of my hearing. My eyes stung with tears, though I couldn't say why. I retreated to the bungalow, heart pounding like I'd done something momentous. That night, I slept in fits, half expecting a wave of ghostly children to swirl around my bed, but I heard nothing more than the typical night sounds. When morning came, I ventured to the clearing with anxious curiosity. My offering remained on the seesaw, the candle tipped over but unlit, the note still pinned by a small stone. No sign of footprints or new items. A sense of calm, or maybe acceptance, hovered in the clearing. Encouraged, I set about clearing some of the brush around the playground, collecting the old toys I found, tarnished tin soldiers, plastic dolls missing limbs, marbles cloudy with age. Part of me wanted to bury them, but I decided to place them in a small wooden box. If these items carried memories, maybe gathering them respectfully would help. In the following days, I sensed the atmosphere lighten. The nighttime giggles receded. The scuttling in the yard diminished, replaced by the usual hush of country nights. I began to let my guard down, savoring the mountainous horizon without scanning for spectral forms. One early morning, I found a single fresh footprint in the dew, small and childlike, leading from the clearing to my porch, then vanishing. Instead of fear, I felt a gentle pang, like a child had visited me to say goodbye. I left the footprint undisturbed until the sun burned off the dew, thinking maybe it was the final sign of an uneasy peace. I decided to do one last act of closure. I'd read about planting a small memorial garden in haunted places, giving the unsettled spirits a living dedication. So, with trembling hands, I tilled a corner of the clearing near the playground, adding fresh soil and compost to the sandy ground. I found some hardy flowers that might survive the region's conditions: zinnias, black-eyed Susans, and a couple of ferns. One bright morning, I spent hours planting them in a careful semicircle around the old merry-go-round's base. I made small markers out of pebbles, forming a ring. Then, in the center, I placed that wooden box of retrieved toys, half buried so that only the top was visible, the old plastic dolls and tin soldiers inside. "This is your place," I murmured, voice unsteady. "I hope you find comfort here." Another breeze, another hush. The pines overhead seemed to murmur softly, as if the mountain air had accepted my tribute. From that moment on, the clearing felt transformed. No longer oppressive or thick with sorrow, it radiated a gentle hush, akin to a forgotten cemetery that had been visited by someone who cared. I noticed the difference in my own spirit, too. My shoulders felt lighter, my nights less fraught with tension. When I walked at dusk, I no longer jumped at every rustle of leaves. The bungalow, though still a work in progress, felt like a genuine home at last. Occasionally, I'd sense a distant giggle in the twilight, but it drifted away like a harmless breeze, never lingering. Months have passed, and the mountain seasons are changing. My memorial garden in the clearing stands vibrant, the flowers I planted stubbornly enduring. Each time I see their bright petals, I recall the initial fear that gnawed at me. Yet also, I remember how that fear guided me to an empathy for the land's unspoken memories, for the ghostly children who might once have played under a summer sun. I've told no one in the nearest town about my memorial. Let them keep their legends. This small act was for me, and for the spirits, if indeed they linger. In the quiet moments just after sunrise, I sometimes wander to that clearing, kneeling beside the box of old toys. I feel the hush of the pines, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, and I imagine the echoes of children's laughter from decades past. I've come to believe that places record the joys and sorrows of those who once walked there, and maybe, by acknowledging them, we can ease their burden, and ours. I stand up, gaze at the swings, now gently swaying in the morning breeze, the rusted chains glinting in the golden light. I can almost see a small figure perched on the seat, smiling before vanishing in the corner of my vision. Friends from my old life sometimes call, half-jokingly asking if I've grown bored in the mountains. I reply that the Catskills have an endless depth if you know where to look, and that I've found peace in ways I never did among city skyscrapers. They probably picture me as a lonely hermit, and, in a sense, I am. But this solitude is filled with meaning. I might never fully unravel the story of that old camp, or the child who might have died there, but I've made a place for them in my life, and in doing so, I carved out a space for myself in these old mountains. There are nights I lie awake, listening to the wind funnel down the slopes, rattling the windows of my little bungalow. My chest feels warm, remembering the city's frantic pulse and how it nearly drowned me. Now, the hush breathes around me, the forest a choir of subtle voices. If I strain, I can occasionally pick out a soft giggle or the faint creak of a swing chain in the distance. It doesn't frighten me anymore. It's more like an assurance that this land's stories continue, that I'm merely a steward for the time I reside here. I drift to sleep with that knowledge, my mind at ease. This is my life in the Catskills. By day, I fix up the bungalow or roam the trails in search of vantage points for painting or writing. By evening, I watch the shadows lengthen across the yard, no longer bracing for ghostly laughter, but open to the hush that arrives with the stars. Sometimes, when the moon is high, I'll walk to the clearing, place a fresh flower on the merry-go-round, and whisper a greeting to those ephemeral children. The hush feels alive, an old friend I've learned to trust. And in that hush, I sense gratitude, or perhaps reflection, both on the land's side and mine. I suppose that's all I can say. I remain here, in a battered bungalow near Phoenicia, forging a life shaped by the dual forces of living and departed. In time, maybe the memory of the children's giggles will fade as the land heals, or maybe it will persist as a gentle echo for future wanderers. I plan to stay either way, content to be a quiet guardian of a place once filled with youthful laughter, now half swallowed by the forest. And who knows, in this expansive hush, I might finally discover the deeper purpose I left the city to find. For now, each morning, I greet the day with a sense of reverence, step onto my porch with coffee in hand, and let the wind carry the distant sound of a swing's rusted chain, a memory bridging past and present, reminding me that I, too, belong to a chain of stories that ripple through the mountains, refusing to be forgotten.